Prime Minister.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I hope very much our connection works today. This is my last day of virtual meetings with ministerial colleagues and others before I come out of isolation. In addition to my virtual meetings and duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
We're now going across to Lawrence Robertson in Tewkesbury. Lawrence Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister guarantee that in any agreement he reaches with the European Union, that British sovereignty will be protected for the whole of the United Kingdom and that the UK will exit the transitional period on the 31st of December as a whole?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed. I can make that guarantee, Mr. Speaker, and our position on fish hasn't changed. We'll only be able to make progress if the EU accepts the reality that we must be able to control access to our waters. And it's very important at this stage to emphasise that point.
The Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls. On average, a woman is killed by a man every 3 days in this country. It's a shocking statistic. And sadly, the pandemic has seen a significant increase in domestic abuse. I'll join those marking this day, and I'm sure the whole House would agree we need to do far more to end domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister may remember that in August of last year, he wrote the foreword to the Ministerial Code. It says, and I quote, "There must be no bullying, no harassment, no leaking, no misuse of taxpayers' money, no actual or perceived conflicts of interest." That's 5 promises in 2 sentences. How many of those promises does the Prime Minister think his ministers have kept?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the ministers of this government are working hard and overall doing an outstanding job in delivering the people's priorities, and that's what we will continue to do. And I think if he waits a little bit longer today, he'll hear some of the ways in which this government is going to be taking this country forward with one of the most ambitious programmes of investment in infrastructure, in our schools, our hospitals, for generations. And if he wants to make any particular allegations about individual ministers or their conduct, then he's welcome to do so. And the floor is his.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't really hear an answer there. So why don't we go through these commitments in turn, starting with bullying and harassment. The now former independent advisor on ministerial standards concluded that the Home Secretary's behaviour was, in his words, in breach of the ministerial code, and he said can be described as bullying, which, Mr. Speaker, means intimidating or insulting behaviour that makes an individual feel uncomfortable, frightened, less respected or put down. What message does the Prime Minister think it sends that the independent advisor on standards has resigned, but the Home Secretary is still in post?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary, Sir Alex's decisions are entirely a matter for him, but the Home Secretary has apologised for any way in which her conduct fell short. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, I make no apology for sticking up, for standing by a Home Secretary who, as I said just now, is getting on with delivering on the people's priorities, putting already 6,000 of the 20,000 more police out on the street to fight crime, instituting in the teeth of very considerable resistance a new Australian-style points-based immigration system. She's getting on with delivering what I think the people of this country want. She's showing a steely determination, and I think that's probably why his side continue to bash her.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that any other Prime Minister would have fired the Home Secretary, and any other Home Secretary would have resigned. So I think we'll chalk that up as one broken promise. On to the next. No leaking. Over the summer, we saw repeated leaks about which areas would go into restrictions. The Prime Minister's plans to go into a second national lockdown were leaked all over the national papers, resulting in a truly chaotic press conference. And we've seen more leaking in the last 24 hours. This serial leaking is causing huge anxiety to millions of people about what's going to happen next. Now, I know there's supposed to be an inquiry underway, but can the Prime Minister tell us, is he any closer to working out who in his government is leaking this vital information?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've already told you that as soon as we have any information about anybody leaking, we'll bring it to the House. But I may say, I think the right honourable gentleman is really concentrating on trivia, when what the people of this country want is to see his support and the support of politicians across the House for the tough measures that we're putting in to defeat coronavirus. He makes various attacks on, I think, on my leadership and the handling of the ministerial code. I take them a lot more seriously, frankly, Mr. Speaker, if the leader of the opposition could explain whether or why the right honourable gentleman, the member for Islington North, is still a member of the Labour Party. Does he support the right honourable member for Islington North continued membership of the Labour Party? Yes or no? Why doesn't he answer that question?
I think I'll just answer the fact that it actually is Prime Minister's questions, not Leader of the Opposition questions. Keir Starmer.
Reasonable question, Mr. Speaker.
I think I'll make that decision, Prime Minister. And I think, thankfully, we've got the sound. We don't want to lose it. Keir Starmer.
It was your end last time, by the way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The difference, of course, is that I'm tackling the issues in my party. He's running away from the issues in his. And I take it from his answer. I take it from his answer that he's no idea who's leaking from his government. So I think we put that's another one in the no column. Moving on. Perhaps the most serious of the promises under the code: no misuse of taxpayers' money. For weeks, I've raised concern about the government's spraying taxpayers' money on contracts that don't deliver. The problem, Mr. Speaker, is even worse than we thought. This week, a Cabinet Office response suggests that the government purchased not 50 million unusable items of protective equipment, but 180 million. And a new report this morning by the National Audit Office identifies a further set of orders totalling £214 million for face masks for the NHS that it can't use. So will the Prime Minister come clean? How many hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money has been wasted on equipment that can't be used?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, actually 99.5%, to answer his question directly, 99.5% of the PPE, the 32 billion items of PPE that this country has secured, conformed entirely to our clinical needs once we checked it. And I think of all the lines of attack, the pathetic lines of attack that we've heard so far, this is the feeblest. Because if you remember, Mr. Speaker, we were faced with a national pandemic that on a scale that we hadn't seen before, and the government was being attacked by the Labour Party for not moving fast enough to secure PPE. I remember the right honourable gentleman saying that we needed to unblock the blockages in the system and that we needed to shift heaven and earth to get it done. That's what he said at the beginning of the pandemic. Then he complained that we moved too slow. Now he's saying that we moved too fast. He's got to make up his mind what his attack is.
Keir Starmer.
Well, it's obvious that either the Prime Minister doesn't know how much taxpayers' money has been wasted, or he doesn't care. So far, Mr. Speaker, that's bullying, harassment, leaking and misuse of taxpayers' money. I must say, Prime Minister, it's not looking good so far, so let's press on. The next one is no actual or perceived conflicts of interest. Where do I start on this one, Mr. Speaker? Last week, we learned that suppliers with political connections were 10 times more likely to be awarded government contracts. This week, the Sunday Times reports that the Health Secretary appointed one of his closest friends to a key advisory role. This friend also is a major shareholder, as it happens, in a firm that specialises in lobbying the government on behalf of its clients, and some of those clients have secured tens of millions of pounds of government contracts during the pandemic. Was the Prime Minister aware of this apparent conflict of interest?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, insofar as there are any conflicts of interest, they will be evident from the publication of all the details of all the contracts. And again, he just seems to be attacking the government for shifting heaven and earth, as we did, to get the medicines, to get the PPE, to get the equipment, to get the treatments that this country needed. And what it reveals really is a deep underlying Labour hatred of the private sector. And it's actually thanks to the private sector and government working with the private sector that the UK was able to produce the world's first usable treatment for the disease in dexamethasone, the world's first, and has worked hard to secure huge numbers of doses of the world's first usable room temperature vaccine. That's the private sector working to deliver for the people of this country. And it's common sense, conservative government working with the private sector rather than abominating them and relying exclusively on some deranged form of state control. How else does he think we could possibly have done it?
Keir Starmer.
No one's knocking the private sector. The government's knocking the taxpayer. And that's not trivial. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it's a clean sweep. Bullying, harassment, leaking, wasting public money and obvious conflicts of interest. It's the same old story. One rule for the British public, another for the Prime Minister and his friends. Just look at the contrast between his attitude to spraying public money at contracts that don't deliver and his attitude to pay rises for the key workers who kept the country going during this pandemic. If you've got a hotline to ministers, you get a blank cheque. But if you're on the front line tackling COVID, you're picking up the bill. So will the Prime Minister finally get his priorities right, stop wasting taxpayers' money and give police officers, firefighters, care workers and other key workers the pay rise they so obviously deserve?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's this party and this government that has given key workers, public sector workers, above inflation pay rises this year, as he knows, for police, for the army, for nurses are now getting 12.6% more than they were 3 years ago. And it is this government that will continue to increase the living wage, as he will discover if you just contain his impatience just for a few minutes. Indeed, it's this government that has not only delivered free school meals and vast increase in spending on development around the world, but has looked after the poorest and the neediest. And one of the most important facts about the coronavirus package, the £200 billion package of support that the Chancellor has devised for lives and livelihoods across the country, is that the benefits for overwhelmingly prioritise the poorest and neediest in the country. And the reason we can do that is because we have a government that understands how to run a strong economy and to makes sure that it takes the tough decisions now that will allow our economy to bounce back. And that's what this government is doing.
Laura Trott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the promised increase in education funding? And I look forward to hearing the detail this afternoon. Can I ask the Prime Minister that some of this money is spent on school building repairs, particularly for voluntary controlled and multi-academy trusts, such as Orchards Academy and West Kingsdown in my own constituency? These types of schools were unable to apply for the most recent round of funding and are in urgent need of repair.
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we've allocated an additional £560 million this year for essential maintenance and upgrades in the school estate, on top of more than £1.4 billion. And in Kent, £20 million is going to Kent Local Authority, including West Kingsdown Church of England Primary School, and nearly £6 million to Kemnall Academies Trust, Mr. Speaker. And I would encourage my honourable friend to continue her excellent campaign.
Let's head up to Scotland with Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Protecting the foreign aid budget has long been a source of unity and agreement across this House and indeed across the four nations of the United Kingdom. At the last general election, every major party recommitted to that moral mission of helping the world's poorest and most vulnerable. Indeed, a senior government minister said that, and I quote, paved the way for Britain to meet the UN target of spending 0.7% of national income on aid, and that remains our commitment. Does the Prime Minister agree with that senior government minister?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, listening to members opposite talking about the 0.7, you'd think that they'd invented it. It was the Conservative government that instituted, and I think this country can be incredibly proud of what we have delivered for the poorest and neediest people in the world. That will continue. We're one of the, on any view, where this country is one of the biggest investors or donors overseas in all its forms. I think we're the second biggest in the G7 on any view, in whether in percentage terms or in cash terms, and that will continue. We've seen a massive increase, as the House will know, in spending on our collective overseas commitments. And by the way, the Right Honourable Gentleman will know that is a huge benefit also to Scotland, where East Kilbride, there are people who do a fantastic job in development overseas.
Returning to Scotland, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad that the Prime Minister seemed to agree with the quote, because the words I quoted were his. It's exactly what he told the House of Commons less than 6 months ago, and I can take it that the briefing that's gone on won't be true, that the 0.7% will remain in place. And Mr. Speaker, we need to recognise that the COVID-19 is a global pandemic, and whilst we're all in the same storm, some nations have better life rafts. The World Bank estimate that the pandemic will push an estimated 88 to 150 million people into extreme poverty. In the world's poorest countries, hunger and cases of malaria are rising, and the UN projects that as many as 11 million girls may never return to education after school closes. The UK government cannot eradicate the threat of COVID-19 if there is still a threat around the world. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that keeping the commitment of 0.7% is not only the right thing to do morally, but it is the sensible thing to do in helping with the eradication of COVID-19?
Prime Minister.
Of course, I agree that the UK should be playing a leading role in eradicating COVID-19 around the world. And that's why one of the wonderful features of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, if it is approved, is that it's going to be sold at cost to partners around the world. And I wonder whether he knows quite how much the UK has already given to COVAX, to the Global Vaccine Alliance. I can tell him it's more than virtually any other country in the world. We should be proud in this country of what we're doing. I think about $800 million to support COVAX, to say nothing of what we're doing with Gavi and CEPI and other organizations. We are in the lead in promoting, not just inventing vaccines, but in making sure that the poorest and neediest around the world get those vaccines. And I think the people of this country should be very proud of what they're doing.
Let's head up to Burton with Kate Griffiths. Kate Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's pledge in the 10-point plan to plant 30,000 hectares of trees a year by 2025. Farmers will play a crucial role in meeting this target. What financial incentives will be available to encourage them to make this long-term commitment?
Prime Minister.
Our friend is dead right, and what we're going to do is use the new freedoms we have after leaving the Common Agricultural Policy to support farmers to beautify the landscape, to make it less prone to flooding, and we're putting £640 million from the Nature for Climate Fund into helping to support the planting of 30,000 hectares of trees by 2025, every year by 2025.
David.
3 weeks ago, I asked the Prime Minister to support unpaid carers who are facing extreme hardship during COVID by raising carers allowance by £20 a week. It's very disappointing the ministers haven't found that money for carers, but have found hundreds of millions for contracts handed out to Conservative Party cronies. Mr. Speaker, it's Carers' Rights Day tomorrow, so can I ask the Prime Minister again, will he either raise carers' allowance by £20 a week, as Liberal Democrats are campaigning for, or will he explain why Conservatives think unpaid carers don't deserve extra help?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll be happy to look at that specific grant again, but I have to say that you look at what we've done so far with supporting universal credit and the substantial increases in the living wage. We're doing our best to support families who are the neediest across the whole of the UK. And as I say, one of the stunning features, one of the most remarkable features of the package that we've given to support lives and livelihoods is that the benefits do fall disproportionately and quite rightly on the poorest and the neediest.
David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure, like me, the Prime Minister welcomes the incredibly valuable contribution of our essential workers in keeping our society moving, our economy turning and keeping us safe. But we know that many of our constituents are facing challenges through COVID. So on that note, does the Prime Minister agree with me and many colleagues that as we are having intense discussions on how to balance the nation's finances, that now is not the time for an MP's pay rise?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I do agree with that, and that's why we've frozen ministerial salaries this year, as indeed they've been frozen by successive Conservative governments since 2010. And I know that IPSA will have heard my honourable friend, and I'd encourage them not to proceed.
Let's go over to Northern Ireland with Stephen Farry. Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Northern Ireland business community is extremely concerned that it is now impossible to be ready to fully implement the protocol from the 1st of January. Their top priority is to ask the EU for an adjustment or grace period. This request is based on respect for the protocol and is not about an extension to the transition period. Will the Prime Minister give his support to this ask?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course, we're not going to extend the transition period, but we want to make practical arrangements to help businesses in Northern Ireland, and we've agreed, for instance, a one-year adjustment period, so there's no disruption to the flow of medicines. And we've already launched a 200 million trader support service to help agri-food businesses and others, and that's going to more details will be announced shortly, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Flood risk from new development is a key concern for many of my constituents, highlighted by a case in Ickford, where developers promised that flood risk would be a once-in-a-100-year eventuality, yet the village has flooded 3 times this year alone. With that in mind, will my right honourable friend commit to seriously beefing up the way flood risk is assessed and treated as part of the planning process?
Prime Minister.
Well, I have deep sympathy, Mr. Speaker, for his constituency in Ickford and the flooding they've suffered. I know Ickford. What I can say is it's very important that local authorities do follow the rules in making their planning decisions. I'm sure he would agree. And we're making a huge £5.2 billion investment in flood defences to protect the 300,000 homes that are at risk across the country.
Mr. Speaker, the Greater Manchester Metrolink tram system cuts carbon emissions, improves air quality and reduces congestion on our roads. As part of the post-COVID recovery plan, will the Prime Minister commit funding to extend the tram network from East Didsbury to Stockport Town Centre in order to improve access and give much-needed support to businesses and communities in my constituency?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I will study the plan he proposes with care, though I should tell him that there is already a massive infrastructure programme underway already, and it may be that as the Chancellor will shortly announce, and it may be that in due time the scheme he proposes could benefit from those investments.
Let's head to Romford with Andrew Rosendale. Andrew Rosendale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the London area potentially entering stricter Tier 3 or Tier 2 lockdown measures, and the devastating consequences this will have to bring on jobs, livelihoods, businesses, and indeed the effects on physical and mental health, as the Prime Minister is committed to following the evidence, will he agree to a full public cost-benefit analysis on its impact on our economy and public health before he introduces anything that will lead to years of economic harm that could end up being worse on people's lives than the virus itself?
Minister.
Yes, I have a high regard for my honourable friend, and he's right to call attention to the dangers and the damage that lockdowns can do. Of course, they have to be weighed against the damage to health that's caused by a wave of coronavirus that drives out all other patients from our hospitals and affects the health of non-COVID patients as well, so very badly. We will of course be setting out an analysis of the health, economic and social impacts of the tiered approach and the data that supports the tiering decisions as we have done in the past.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When 72 Londoners burned to death at Grenfell because of a cladding defect, we all said, never again. But for hundreds of thousands, the living nightmare of Waking Watch and the non-existent EWS1 form continues. So will the Prime Minister commit that no leaseholder anywhere should foot the bill for what's no fault of their own, and make good on the 2017 CLG Secretary's promise to end this neo-feudal absurdity of a tenure once and for all?
Prime Minister.
Yes. Well, Mr. Speaker, she's right to call attention to the difficulties that many people are facing because of the EWS1 form, and I sympathise very much with them. Mortgage companies should realise that they are not necessary for buildings under 18 metres, and it's absolutely vital that they understand that. Whilst we get on with the work of removing cladding from all the buildings, we can, and that's what this government is continuing to do.
William Case.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome plans for a green industrial revolution, particularly commitments to public transport. But delivering sustainable rural bus services has always been a challenge. But in my constituency, South Pennine Community Transport is trialling a new low-cost, low-carbon bus service that we believe could be a model to transform rural bus services across the UK. So would my right honourable friend meet with me and South Pennine Director Kevin Carr to discuss this model and look at how some of the government's £5 billion commitment to buses can be used to transform rural services?
Prime Minister.
Well, she's asking an excellent question, and we are developing a national bus strategy that will look at the needs of how to get more people to use our buses, and in addition to championing green, zero carbon or low carbon buses, we're providing £20 million for a rural mobility fund to support demand in rural areas.
Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Food bank use in my constituency has been increasing steadily as working families, including public sector key workers, struggle to make ends meet. Can the Prime Minister therefore tell us whether he thinks the median pay of teaching assistants of just under £14,000 and nursing auxiliaries of £18,000 is enough to live on? And I'll ask the Prime Minister again, instead of delivering a public sector pay freeze later today, will he instead give these key workers a well-deserved pay rise?
Prime Minister.
She's right to value key workers and the amazing job that they do, particularly teachers and teaching assistants. And they've done a fantastic work in getting our kids back into school over the last few months, and they continue to do an amazing job. And I'm proud actually of the work we've done, not just to increase public sector pay with inflation busting package in July for the third year running, but also for what we're doing to support the increases, record increases in the living wage, delivered, Mr. Speaker, by a Conservative government, invented by a Conservative government, because Conservative governments can do these things because we understand how to run a strong economy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Lincolnshire has one of the highest populations of veterans in our country, and as such, can I warmly welcome the recent announcement to boost funding for our armed forces. Does the Prime Minister agree that one of the best ways in which we can help our veterans is to encourage employers to hire a hero?
Prime Minister.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for the campaigns that he's running to support veterans, and we support schemes such as that run by Jerry Hill and his team at Hire a Hero, and we are encouraging businesses to hire veterans with a new national insurance tax break for businesses that do so, and of course making it easier for veterans to join the civil service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bio Yorkshire will place York at the heart of the global bioscience economy. It will cut carbon by 2,800 kilotons, create 4,000 green-collar jobs, upskill 25,000 workers and return £5 billion to the Treasury. The government are supportive but are delaying investment until at least the devolution deal. Unemployment in York is soaring. We need this investment now. Will he start the recovery by investing in Bio Yorkshire?
Rachel, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as she knows, the government is committed to the 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, which will generate 250,000 jobs across the country just in the immediate term. I hope very much that Bio Yorkshire will be amongst the beneficiaries, and I can't see any reason why it should not.
Hammond. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The news of the COVID vaccine is great for both my constituents in Wimbledon and across the country. But I believe when my constituents get sick, they should have the right to the highest quality access to healthcare. And the plans to improve and invest in St Helier Hospital would do just that. Would the Prime Minister work with me to ensure that those plans are brought forward as quickly as possible, despite the opposition from local Labour politicians?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and how typical of Labour or politicians locally to oppose what they call for nationally. I'm proud that we're going ahead with a brand new state-of-the-art hospital that's going to be built in Sutton, and with most services staying put in a modernised buildings at Epsom and St Helier. The new hospital will come as part of the government's commitment, as I say, to build 48 hospitals by 2030 in the biggest hospital building programme of a generation.
Let's head to the goer with Tony Antoniazzi. Tony Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the summer, we stood on our doorsteps and clapped for all of our key workers. Today, they will be hit once again with a real terms pay cut to their wages by the Chancellor's pay freeze. Now, Mr. Speaker, I really do wonder, does the Prime Minister actually realise that claps don't pay the bills?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Honourable Lady would recognise that at a time when the private sector, when the UK economy has been so badly hit, when private sector workers have seen falls in their incomes, it is right that we should be responsible in our approach to public finances, and that's what we're going to be. But be in no doubt that the commitments that we have made have been outstanding so far, above inflation increases for public sector workers just in July, 12.6% increase for nurses over the last 3 years, biggest ever increase in the living wage, and more to come in just a minute if she'll contain herself.
Richard Fuller.
Mr. Speaker, last month, the Year 6 students at the Edward Peake Church of England Middle School in Biggleswade wrote to me about the impact of lockdown and their ideas for promoting a healthier planet, including encouraging people not to put waste into the sea, planting more trees and building more electric cars, making more nature reserves and cleaning up the waterways, encouraging more local electricity production and reducing air pollution so children can see the stars. So will the Prime Minister join me in thanking the students and their teacher, Miss Twitchett, and tell the House if their ideas can play a part in his green plan?
Prime Minister.
Well, it's quite uncanny, Mr. Speaker. It's as though Mrs. Twitchett and her class were standing over my shoulder as I wrote the 10-point plan, and I thank them for their telepathic inspiration I passionately agree that this is the right way forward for our country. It's going to mobilise about £12 billion of government investment, about possibly 3 times more from the private sector, and as I say, create 250,000, 300,000 jobs. It's a fantastic way forward for our country.
John Trickett.
I'm sure that the Prime Minister will share the pleasure which all of us have in the great engineering skills which are displayed in our country, especially in the north. And that one of the great jewels in the crown are the engineers at Rolls-Royce. But is he aware that Rolls-Royce are about to offshore 350 jobs for the north of England? That will be a devastating blow to that part of the country and remove part of our national industrial infrastructure. Does he agree that the campaign of the workforce is in the national interest to retain those jobs in our country? And finally, would he use everything in his power to ensure that that offshoring does not take place?
Prime Minister.
Can I just say to the honourable gentleman, he's so right to support Rolls-Royce, one of the great companies in our country, and we want to make sure. Obviously, Rolls is suffering at the moment from the problems in the aerospace sector, the fact that no one is flying. When you make a lot of your money from servicing aero engines, as Rolls-Royce does, it's a very difficult time at the moment. We're keen to work with Rolls to ensure that Rolls-Royce, to ensure that company has a long-term future as a great British company. And he's making an excellent point, and I can assure him that the government is on it.
That's it.
Speaker, I'm aware there are obviously no perfect options at the moment, but can I raise with the Prime Minister the issue of pubs and bars who will be affected by the Tier 2 restrictions? Many of these, such as Yorkshire Ales in Snaith in my constituency, have invested considerable amounts of money into being COVID secure, and they will now be denied access to their valuable pre-Christmas trade. Can the Prime Minister look again at those Tier 2 restrictions, and if not, look at what other financial support can be offered to those bars and restaurants that cannot offer a substantial food offering during this period?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is completely right about the need to support local business, and particularly in the hospitality sector. And he should know that in addition to the £3,000 grant for businesses that are forced to close, we've got another a grant of £2,100 per month for businesses that in the hospitality and accommodation sector. That's on top of the support that we've given via furlough, obviously, and via business rates and the cuts in VAT, which are obviously intended to support the hospitality sector as well. I am keenly aware of how difficult it is for those pubs, bars, restaurants, hotels that are will face a tough time in the tiers as we come out next week. We will do our level best to support them. I should say we're also giving 1.1 billion to local councils to help them support businesses that are facing difficulties. But I just want to say one thing to the House as we come out of the lockdown. The way forward is not just through the vaccine, which we hope we will be able to start rolling out in the course of the next few weeks and months, but it's also this prospect of mass community testing. And I want to pay tribute to the people of Liverpool who have really stepped up, and in huge numbers, hundreds of thousands of people in Liverpool have been tested, and that seems to have helped to drive the virus down in Liverpool. And we want to see that type of collective action stepping up to squeeze the disease happening across the country. So and that, I think, is a real way forward that will enable the hospitality, accommodation, hotel sector to come out of these restrictive measures quicker than has been recently possible. We've got two new very important scientific developments.
That is to answer the question, Prime Minister. I'm very pleased that the House of Commons has been able to help deliver an improvement to the sound and vision from number 10 today. But we'd like our kit back this afternoon, Prime Minister. Right, in order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. Order. I'm very pleased that the House of Commons has been able to help deliver an improvement to the sound and vision. Oh, that's from number 10, I think. Before I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I've already got that one in. I think I might push my luck. Before the Chancellor of the Exchequer addresses the Chamber, I'd like to point out that the British Sign Language interpretation of the statement is available to watch on the parliamentarylive.tv. I now call the Chancellor of the Exchequer to make a statement. Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, today's spending review delivers on the priorities of the British people. Our health emergency is not yet over, and our economic emergency has only just begun. So our immediate priority is to protect people's lives and livelihoods. But today's spending review also delivers stronger public services, paying for new hospitals, better schools, and safer streets. And it delivers a once-in-a-generation investment in infrastructure, creating jobs, growing the economy, increasing pride in the places we call home. Mr. Speaker, our immediate priority is to protect people's lives and livelihoods. So let me begin by updating the House on our response to coronavirus. We're prioritising jobs, businesses, and public services. The furlough scheme, support for the self-employed, loans, grants, tax cuts and deferrals, as well as extra funding for schools, councils, the NHS, charities, culture and sport. Today's figures confirm that taken together, we are providing £280 billion to get our country through coronavirus. Next year, to fund our programmes on testing, PPE, vaccines, we are allocating an initial £18 billion. To protect the public services most affected by coronavirus, we are also providing £3 billion to support NHS recovery, allowing them to carry out up to 1 million checks, scans and operations. Over £2 billion to keep our transport arteries open, subsidising our rail networks. Over £3 billion to local councils, and an extra £250 million to help end rough sleeping. And while much of our coronavirus response is UK-wide, the government is also providing £2.6 billion to support the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Taken together, next year, public services funding to tackle coronavirus will total £55 billion. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the OBR's economic forecasts. And can I thank the new chair, Richard Hughes, and his whole team for their work. The OBR forecasts the economy will contract this year by 11.3%, the largest fall in output for more than 300 years. As the restrictions are eased, they expect the economy to start recovering, growing by 5.5% next year, 6.6% in 2022, then 2.3%, 1.7% and 1.8% in the following years. Even with growth returning, our economic output is not expected to return to pre-crisis levels until the fourth quarter of 2022. And the economic damage is likely to be lasting. Long-term scarring means in 2025, the economy will be around 3% smaller than expected in the March budget. Mr. Speaker, the economic impact of coronavirus and the action we've taken in response means that there has been a significant but necessary increase in our borrowing and debt. The UK is forecast to borrow a total of £394 billion this year, equivalent to 19% of GDP, the highest recorded level of borrowing in our peacetime history. Borrowing falls to £164 billion next year, £105 billion in 22-23, then remains at around £100 billion, 4% of GDP, for the remainder of the forecast. Underlying debt, after removing the temporary effect of the Bank of England's asset purchases, is forecast to be 91.9% of GDP this year. And due to elevated borrowing levels and a forecast persistent current deficit, underlying debt is forecast to continue rising in every year, reaching 97.5% of GDP in 25-26. High as these costs are, the cost of inaction would have been far higher. But this situation is clearly unsustainable over the medium term. We could only act in the way we have because we came into this crisis with strong public finances. And we have a responsibility, once the economy recovers, to return to a sustainable fiscal position. Mr. Speaker, this is an economic emergency. That's why we have taken and continue to take extraordinary measures to protect people's jobs and incomes. And it is clear those measures are making a difference. The OBR now state, as the Bank of England and IMF already have, that our economic response has protected jobs, supported incomes, and helped businesses stay afloat. They've said today that business insolvencies have fallen compared to last year. And the latest data shows the UK's unemployment rate is lower than Italy, France, Spain, Canada, and the United States. And we're doing more to build on our plan for jobs. I'm announcing today nearly £3 billion for my right honourable friend, the Work and Pension Secretary, to deliver a new 3-year restart programme to help over 1 million people who've been unemployed for over a year find new work. But I've always said, we cannot protect every job. Despite the extraordinary support we've provided, the OBR expects unemployment to rise to a peak in the second quarter of next year of 7.5%, 2.6 million people. Unemployment is then forecast to fall in every year, reaching 4.4% by the end of 2024. Mr. Speaker, today's statistics remind us of something else. Coronavirus has deepened the disparity between public and private sector wages. In the 6 months to September, private sector wages fell by nearly 1% compared to last year. Over the same period, public sector wages rose by nearly 4%. And unlike workers in the private sector who have lost jobs, been furloughed, seen wages cut and hours reduced, the public sector has not. In such a difficult context for the private sector, especially for those people working in sectors like retail, hospitality and leisure, I cannot justify a significant across-the-board pay increase for all public sector workers. Instead, we are targeting our resources at those who need it most. To protect public sector jobs at this time of crisis and ensure fairness between the public and private sectors, I'm taking 3 steps today. First, taking account of the pay review body's advice, we will provide a pay rise to over 1 million nurses, doctors, and others working in the NHS. Second, to protect jobs, pay rises in the rest of the public sector will be paused next year. But third, we will protect those on lower incomes. The 2.1 million public sector workers who earn below the median wage of £24,000 will be guaranteed a pay rise of at least £250. What this means, Mr. Speaker, is that while the government is making the difficult decision to control public sector pay, the majority of public sector workers will see their pay increase next year. And we want to do more for the lowest paid. We are accepting in full the recommendations of the Low Pay Commission to increase the national living wage by 2.2% to £8.91 an hour, to extend this rate to those aged 23 and over, and to increase the national minimum wage rates as well. Taken together, these minimum wage increases will likely benefit around 2 million people. A full-time worker on the national living wage will see their annual earnings increase by £345 next year. And compared to 2016, when the policy was first introduced, that's a pay rise of over £4,000. Mr. Speaker, these are difficult and uncertain economic times, so it is right that our immediate priority is to protect people's health and their jobs. But we need to look beyond. Today's spending review delivers stronger public services, our second priority. And before I turn to the details, let me thank the whole Treasury team, and especially my Right Honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, for their dedication and hard work in preparing today's spending review. Next year, total departmental spending will be £540 billion. Over this year and next, day-to-day, departmental spending will rise in real terms by 3.8%, the fastest growth rate in 15 years. In cash terms, day-to-day departmental budgets will increase next year by £14.8 billion. And, Mr. Speaker, this is a spending review for the whole of the United Kingdom. Through the Barnett formula, today's decisions increase Scottish Government funding by £2.4 billion, Welsh Government funding by £1.3 billion, and £0.9 billion for the Northern Ireland Executive. The whole of the United Kingdom will benefit from the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and over time, we will ramp up funding so that total domestic UK-wide funding will at least match EU receipts, on average reaching around £1.5 billion a year. To help local areas prepare for the introduction of the UK SPF, next year we will provide funding for communities to pilot programmes and new approaches. And we will accelerate 4 city and growth deals in Scotland, helping Tay cities, Borderlands, Moray and the Scottish Islands create jobs and prosperity in their areas. Mr. Speaker, our public spending plans deliver on the priorities of the British people. Today's spending review honours our historic multi-year commitment to the NHS. Next year, the core health budget will grow by £6.6 billion, allowing us to deliver 50,000 more nurses and 50 million more general practice appointments. We're increasing capital investment by £2.3 billion to invest in new technologies to improve patient and staff experience, replace ageing diagnostic machines like MRI and CT scanners, and fund the biggest hospital building programme in a generation, building 40 new hospitals and upgrading 70 more. We're investing in social care too. Today's settlement allows local authorities to increase their core spending power by 4.5%. Local authorities will have extra flexibility for council tax and adult social care precept, which together with £300 million of new grant funding gives them access to an extra £1 billion to fund social care. And this is on top of the extra £1 billion social care grant we provided this year, which I can confirm will be maintained. To provide a better education for our children, we're also getting on with our 3-year investment plan for schools. We'll increase the schools budget next year by £2.2 billion, well on the way to delivering our commitment of an extra £7.1 billion by 22-23. Every pupil in the country will see a year-on-year funding increase of at least 2%. And we're funding the Prime Minister's commitment to rebuild 500 schools over the next decade. And we're also committed to boosting skills with £291 million to pay for more young people to go into further education, £1.5 billion to rebuild colleges, £375 million to deliver the Prime Minister's Lifetime Skills Guarantee and extend traineeships, sector-based work academies and the National Career Service, as well as improving the way the apprenticeship system works for businesses. And we're also making our streets safer. Next year, funding for the criminal justice system will increase by over £1 billion. We're providing more than £400 million to recruit 6,000 new police officers, well on track to recruit 20,000. And £4 billion over 4 years to provide 18,000 new prison places. New hospitals, better schools, safer streets. The British people's priorities are this government's priorities. Mr. Speaker, today's spending review strengthens the United Kingdom's place in the world. This country has always and will always be open and outward-looking, leading in solving the world's toughest problems. But during a domestic fiscal emergency, when we need to prioritise our limited resources on jobs and public services, sticking rigidly to spending 0.7% of our national income on overseas aid is difficult to justify to the British people, especially when we're seeing the highest peacetime levels of borrowing on record. I have listened with great respect to those who have argued passionately to retain this target. But at a time of unprecedented crisis, government must make tough choices. I want to reassure the House that we will continue to protect the world's poorest, spending the equivalent of 0.5% of our national income on overseas aid in 2021, allocating £10 billion at this spending review. And our intention is to return to 0.7% when the fiscal situation allows. Based on the latest OECD data, the UK would remain the second highest aid donor in the G7, higher than France, Italy, Japan, Canada, and the United States. And 0.5% is also considerably more than the 29 countries on the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, who average just 0.38%. And overseas aid is, of course, only one of the ways we play our role in the world. The Prime Minister has announced over £24 billion of investment in defence over the next 4 years, the biggest sustained increase in 30 years, allowing us to provide security not just for our country, but around the world. We're investing more in our extensive diplomatic network, already one of the largest in the world, and providing more funding for new trade deals. We should, however, judge our standing in the world not just by the money we spend, but by the causes we advance and the values we defend. Mr. Speaker, if this spending review's first priority was getting the country through coronavirus, and its second was stronger public services, then our final priority is to deliver our record investment plans in infrastructure. Capital spending next year will total £100 billion, £27 billion more in real terms than last year. Our plans deliver the highest sustained level of public investment in more than 40 years. Once-in-a-generation plans to deliver once-in-a-generation returns for our country. To build housing, we're introducing a £7.1 billion National Home Building Fund on top of our £12.2 billion Affordable Homes programme. We'll deliver faster broadband for over 5 million premises across the UK. Better mobile connectivity with 4G coverage across 95% of the country by 2025. The biggest ever investment in new roads, upgraded railways, new cycle lanes, and over 800 zero-emission buses. Our capital plans will invest in the greener future we promised, delivering the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for climate change. We're making this country a scientific superpower with almost £15 billion of funding for research and development. And we're publishing today a comprehensive new national infrastructure strategy. To help finance our plans, I can also announce we will establish a new UK infrastructure bank. Headquartered in the north of England, the bank will work with the private sector to finance major new investment projects across the United Kingdom, starting this spring. Mr. Speaker, I have one further announcement to make. For many people, the most powerful barometer of economic success is the change they see and the pride they feel in the places we call home. People want to be able to look around their towns and villages and say, yes, our community, this place, is better off than it was 5 years ago. For too long, our funding approach has been complex and ineffective, and I want to change that. Today, I'm announcing a new Levelling Up Fund worth £4 billion. Any local area will be able to bid directly to fund local projects. The fund will be managed jointly between the Treasury, the Department for Transportation, and the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, taking a new, holistic, place-based approach to the needs of local areas. Projects must have real impact. They must be delivered within this Parliament, and they must command local support, including from their Member of Parliament. This is about funding the infrastructure of everyday life. A new bypass, upgraded railway stations, less traffic, more libraries, museums and galleries, better high streets and town centres. This government is funding the things people want and places need. Mr. Speaker, today I've announced huge investment in jobs, public services and infrastructure. And yet, I cannot deny numbers alone can ring hollow. They stand testament to our commitment to create a better nation, but on their own, they are not enough to create one. When asked what our vision for the future of this country is, we cannot point to a shopping list of announcements and feel the job is done. So as we invest billions in research and development, we're also introducing a new immigration system, ensuring the best and brightest from around the world come here to learn, innovate and create. As we invest billions in the building of new homes, we're also simplifying our planning system to ensure beautiful homes are built where they are needed most. As we invest billions in the security of this country, we're also defending free speech and democratic rule, proving our values are more than just words. And as we invest billions in public services, we're also protecting the wages of those on the lowest incomes and supporting jobs, because good work remains the most rewarding and sustainable path to prosperity. The spending review announced today sets us on a path to deal with the material matters of government, and it is a clear statement of our priorities. But encouraging the individual and community brilliance on which a thriving society depends remains, as ever, a work unfinished. We in government can set the direction: better schools, more homes, stronger defence, safer streets, green energy, technological development, improved rail, enhanced roads, all investments that will create jobs and give every person in this country the chance to meet their potential. But it is the individual, the family, and the community that must become stronger, healthier, and happier as a result. This is the true measure of our success. The spending announced today is secondary to the courage, wisdom, kindness, and creativity it unleashes. These are the incalculable but essential parts of our future, and they cannot be mandated or distributed by government. These things must come from each of us and be shared freely, because the future, this better country, is a common endeavour. Today, government has funded the priorities of the British people, and now the job of delivering them begins. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Can I say it's been a very important statement. If people wire, it's run much longer, which was agreed with the Chancellor, and I think it's so important. Obviously, I've respectfully divided the time up to give an increase to the other parts as well. Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Annalise Dodds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This spending review was a moment for the Chancellor to take the responsible choices our country needs. It was an opportunity to protect key workers secure the economy and recover jobs in every part of our country. During this crisis, we've seen who's taken responsibility. Community health workers working round the clock to keep us all safe. The teachers who kept working so key workers could too. The delivery drivers and shop staff who made sure we had critical food supplies. Earlier this year, the Chancellor stood on his doorstep and clapped for key workers. Today, his government institutes a pay freeze for many of them. This takes a sledgehammer to consumer confidence. Firefighters, police officers and teachers will know their spending power is going down, so they will spend less in our small businesses and on our high streets. They will spend less in our private sector. Many key workers who willingly took on so much responsibility during this crisis are now being forced to tighten their belts. Now, not in the medium term to which the Chancellor refers, now. In contrast, there's been a bonanza for those who have won contracts from this government. Companies with political connections have been 10 times more likely to win government contracts. So many businesses have worked tirelessly through this pandemic to support local communities, keep critical supplies going, and to produce drugs and vaccines at cost price in AstraZeneca's case, working with some of our country's best scientists. But in its response to this pandemic, the Conservative government has wasted and mismanaged public finances on an industrial scale. £130 million to a Conservative donor for testing kits that were unsafe. £150 million for face masks and £700 million on coveralls that couldn't be used. A £12 billion hit to our economy because the more effective shorter circuit breaker was blocked and a lengthier, more expensive lockdown put in place instead. £12 billion so far spent on a test and trace system that is still not working. And today, news of £10 billion in additional costs for PPE, at least partly down to the Conservatives' lack of pre-pandemic planning. This waste and mismanagement is part of a longer-term pattern, showing that claims today around levelling up simply don't match the evidence. Hospitals in Liverpool and Sandwell left unbuilt, over deadline by years and over budget by hundreds of millions of pounds. Not a single starter home built, despite almost £200 million being spent. Northern Powerhouse Rail still not even approved 6 years after being announced. The courts modernisation programme 3 years behind schedule, letting victims down up and down this country. People in the north more likely to have been made redundant during this crisis, holding everything else equal. Photo calls aren't enough. We need delivery, like Liam Byrne's promotion of green manufacturing in the West Midlands and the work of Labour mayors and councils across the country. And we need a government in Westminster that takes its responsibility towards all 4 nations seriously. That means informing the Finance Minister of Northern Ireland about the shorter timescale for this spending review ahead of time and fulfilling the new decade, new approach commitments. It means doing the right thing by the people of Wales to repair flood damage and make safe legacy coal tips. It means ending the barney between Westminster and Holyrood and instead working together in partnership to protect jobs and livelihoods. And it means a shared prosperity fund which is effective because it's delivered not on the whim of Conservative ministers, but from our devolved governments and our regions. The Levelling Up Fund, the Chancellor just announced, his rabbit out of the hat, yet again involves MPs, just as with the Beechings reopening programme, going to ministers and begging for support for their areas, rather than that change being driven from local communities. So much, Mr. Speaker, for taking back control. This is about the centre handing over support in a very top-down manner. Now, Labour has been clear about the responsible choices we wanted the Chancellor to make today: to recover jobs, retrain workers and rebuild businesses. To recover jobs, Labour called for £30 billion of capital spending accelerated into the next 18 months, focused on green initiatives, supporting 400,000 jobs and bringing us in line with countries like France and Germany. This government's ambition is for half that number of new jobs. To retrain workers, we needed an emergency programme to support people back into work, but Kickstart has been slow to get started, and the skills offer for those over 25 won't start until April. The Chancellor said at the beginning of his speech that our economic emergency has only just begun. Try telling that to people who've been out of work since March. And Restart, announced today, must meet 3 key tests to be effective. It should help people who need it most, not cherry-pick. It should be up and running as soon as possible, yet it appears only a fraction of Restart funding will be available next year. And Restart must involve local actors who know their communities, not be imposed from Whitehall. And of course, job search support ultimately only works if sufficient new jobs actually exist. That's why we needed ambitious action to boost our economy and to support our businesses. To rebuild business, we called for a national investment bank, and I welcome the announcement of a new UK infrastructure bank, having lost valuable years since the Green Investment Bank was sold off. Now the Chancellor must boost its firepower, and he must deliver on his department's responsibility for the drive to net zero. We've known since the Stern report that the climate crisis is the biggest long-term threat to our economy. Yet far too often, this spending review locks us into a path that will make the transition to net zero harder, not easier, locking our economy out of the green jobs of the future. To rebuild business, the Chancellor also needs to listen to business. We're less than a week from the end of the lockdown, yet we've heard nothing about whether extra support will be provided through the additional restriction support grant for areas subject once again to tough restrictions. And the Chancellor is still threatening employers with an increased contribution to furlough in January at the worst possible time for increasing and building confidence. Mr. Speaker, in less than 40 days, we're due to leave the transition period, yet the Chancellor didn't even mention that in his speech. There's still no trade deal. So does the Chancellor truly believe that his government is prepared and that he's done enough to help those businesses that will be heavily affected? Will he take responsible action also to help those excluded from government support? Why is he still refusing to make the speedy fixes to universal credit Labour has advocated, which would aid the self-employed? And why won't he provide families with certainty by ensuring the increase in universal credit is continued beyond April? The IMF has made clear time and time again that now would be the worst time to slam on the brakes and put the car into reverse. They've called for a meaningful additional push from our government to maintain fiscal support until the recovery is on a sound footing. The UK's GDP is 10% smaller now than it was at the end of last year. We've seen the worst downturn in the G7. We needed ambitious action today to stimulate growth and maintain demand. And we needed this government to take responsibility for the real reasons why people and communities are being held back up and down our country. Over the last 10 years, child poverty has risen by 600,000. We've had the worst decade for pay growth in 8 generations. The cost of childcare has risen twice as fast as wages. The number of young apprentices has plummeted. Last quarter, we saw the highest level of redundancies on record. Social care is an increasing crisis, and despite his party's manifesto promising a long-term solution, we're still waiting. In the press, it was trailed that the Chancellor would be moving 20,000 jobs out of London, yet cuts to local authorities over the last 10 years have seen 240,000 jobs lost, 12 times that figure, with the hardest hit communities often those in the North, Midlands and South West. Today, the Chancellor could have matched his government's promise to do whatever is necessary to support local authorities through this crisis. He did not, and yet again, he showed his government's lack of confidence in its own measures by failing to provide an equality impact assessment. Mr. Speaker, the measure of this government won't be the number of press releases it issued during this crisis or the number of pictures it published on Instagram. It will be the responsible action it took or didn't take for the sake of our country. Next year, the eyes of the world will be on the UK as we assume the presidency of the G7 and of the UN Security Council and host the COP26 summit. Yet now is the time. The Chancellor has turned his back on the world's poorest by cutting international aid. It's in Britain's national interest to lay the foundations for economic growth across the world. No wonder many British businesses have condemned his move. And businesses have been more and more vocal about the problems with this government's last-minute approach, always one step behind when we need to plan responsibly for the future. We must learn the lessons from previous failures and ensure that the next challenge, the rollout of the vaccine, is dealt with as efficiently, effectively and speedily as possible. Next time, Mr. Speaker, we need a comprehensive spending review which takes responsible choices to build a future for our country as the best place in the world to grow up in and the best place to grow old in. People should have opportunities on their doorstep, not at the other end of the country. Everywhere in the UK should feel like a good place to set up home. That's what the Chancellor must deliver.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll address all the points made by the honourable member in turn, but I think it's important to note up front that despite her criticisms, I think there is in fact actually a lot that both she and her colleagues on that side of the House should welcome. More funding for public services, a pay increase for NHS workers, support for those on the lowest incomes, a once-in-a-generation investment in infrastructure, a multi-billion-pound commitment to support those looking for work, a new schools building programme, and the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. I could go on, Mr. Speaker. So whilst it's right that I believe the Honourable Lady should provide challenge, I think that even if she doesn't, the British people would judge this spending review as a reflection of their priorities: protecting jobs, defeating coronavirus, strengthening our public services and upgrading our infrastructure. If there is any politics here at all, Mr. Speaker, then surely it is unifying, and deep down, I think that she will recognise that. To address the specific points, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady asked about pay and about the importance of consumption, and I agree, of course, there is an impact on consumption from pay, and she will know that the marginal propensity to consume is obviously greater the lower the income spectrum you go, which is why, in particular, we have protected the incomes of those on the lower incomes. Anyone in the public sector earning less than the UK median salary of £24,000 will receive a pay rise of £250 or more. Taken with all the other things we've done, including giving a pay rise for those who work in the NHS, this will mean that the majority of public sector workers next year will see an increase in their pay. Also, pay progression, promotions, all of that will also carry on, Mr. Speaker. We've increased wages for those on the national living wage, an extra £345 a year for those as the wage rate goes up to £8.91, and that again will help drive consumption. She talked about delivery rightly. We believe very firmly in making sure that we can deliver the change that we promise the British people. My right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, and I chair something called Project Speed, which is already delivering benefits, Mr. Speaker, with plans for the landmark A66 upgrade, shortened in time, reduced in costs, so we can get on with delivering what the people want on time, on budget, and making a difference in their communities. She asked about the Levelling Up Fund, and I thought rather bizarrely seemed to suggest that local members of Parliament were not a good reflection on their local communities and able to articulate the local needs of their communities. But I would say to colleagues on that side of the House, they will be I'm more than happy to hear from them and their local areas about the needs that they need met, because this government will meet the needs of local communities up and down this country, Mr. Speaker. She talked about support for businesses and coronavirus. It's because we've already put in place the support through this winter period, Mr. Speaker. The local restrictions grants that we announced a while ago are paid monthly. And they work, if your business has been closed, you will receive a grant of up to £3,000 per month, depending on your rateable value. If you are a hospitality or leisure or accommodation business in a Tier 2 area, where obviously the restrictions have an impact on your ability, you will receive a grant of 70% of that value, up to £2,000 as well, £2,100 as well. And Mr. Speaker, those amounts mean that the business can help cover the fixed costs of rent. They, of course, have access to the furlough scheme right the way through the winter. And that comes on top of the other recent support announced for businesses. Today, I announced major reforms to the way that the apprenticeship system works, giving businesses what they have long asked for, the flexibility to spend unused apprenticeship levy funds down the supply chain with SMEs, the ability to front-load payments for training that they've asked for, and we're also looking at ways to introduce even more flexibility for some professions. We also recently, Mr. Speaker, just announced an extension of the annual investment allowance for a further year, up to £1 million, giving 98% of small and medium-sized businesses the ability to write off investments in full next year, which will help drive their recovery. She talked about welfare, Mr. Speaker, and again, I would stand proud of this government and previous Conservative government's record on this issue. Since 2010, hundreds of thousands of fewer people in absolute poverty, several 100,000 children fewer living in workless households, income inequality lower coming into this crisis than it was when we first came into office. But, Mr. Speaker, this government cares greatly about those who are most vulnerable. We have demonstrated that during this crisis by the support that we have put in place. The evidence shows that those on the lowest incomes have been protected the most by this Conservative government. And that doesn't stop, Mr. Speaker. The temporary uplift in universal credit runs all the way through to next spring, providing security for those families. Of course, we will look, when we come to next spring, at the best way to support people, to support their families, when we have a better sense of where the economy is, where we are with this virus. But we are providing extra support for next year, Mr. Speaker, £670 million to help those struggling families meet their council tax bills, worth about £150 each for 3.5 families up and down the country. We have also said that we will maintain the £1 billion increase in the local housing allowance that we instituted this year into next year, providing support for many millions of families. And also, Mr. Speaker, we are making available further funds, as the House knows, to provide extra support for food and meals for children throughout the holidays of next year. She talked about support for local authorities. Perhaps she hasn't seen yet in the doc, and that's fair enough. We announced over £3.5 billion of extra support for local authorities next year, specifically to deal with coronavirus. That comes on top of their core spending power increasing at decade-level highs of 4.5%. That £3.5 billion is there to help meet the shortfall in sales fees and charges, help to meet the unrecoverable losses in business rates and council tax that they've experienced this year, and £1.5 billion for general pressures. Let no one say that we are not standing behind our local authorities at this difficult time, Mr. Speaker. And finally, she asked about green. And I think, Mr. Speaker, she compared us to France and Germany and questioned us, this government, and the Prime Minister's ambition. Well, let me say this about our plans. Our plans, I believe, are amongst the most comprehensive and most ambitious of any developed economy. She talked about France and Germany. This country, we are phasing out vehicles in 2030. In France, it's 2040. In this country, we're phasing out coal in 2025. In Germany, it's 2038. She talked about the billions of pounds that are spent by our friends. I think it's important when we make these international comparisons that we do understand the detail, Mr. Speaker, of what these other countries promise. In the German numbers, they include the subsidies for renewables. We do not. That happens separately, outside of our plan, and is worth £44 billion, Mr. Speaker, supporting renewable energy in this country through the tariff system, which is what Germany alluded to. They also, in their numbers, include support for public transport, which we, of course, do not, because that is something that we do just as a matter of ordinary course of business. I'm proud of this Conservative government's record, Mr. Speaker, the first major economy in the world to legislate for net zero, the economy that has decarbonised faster than any other in the last 20 years. This Conservative government will deliver the Prime Minister's plans to get us to net zero, and it's something that I hope the whole House can welcome and support. So, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, this spending review puts the full force of government behind the priorities of the British people. And whilst we may have many disagreements with the party opposite, I am confident that in private, at least, they will recognise the significant investment we are making to protect jobs, strengthen our public services, and improve our infrastructure. We are all in this House answerable to the people we represent. It is in their interests that we serve. Today, we have made some difficult choices in order to fulfil that responsibility. But with the positive news about the development of vaccines, the winter COVID plan being announced by the Prime Minister, and the very real hope that we are finally entering the final stages of our fight against coronavirus, now is the time for us to come together. The British people have been through so much this year. Honourable and right honourable members have been through so much this year. It is my belief that with this spending review and the fresh hope given by medical advances, we can finally begin our recovery. Now, difficult decisions and all, we must deliver on the priorities of the British people.
Let's head down to the southwest with the chair of the Treasury Committee, Mel Stride. Mel Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I very much welcome many of the positive measures that my right honourable friend has just announced. However, inevitably, he has revealed some of the more difficult decisions that he's had to make around a reduction in overseas development aid and the freezing of public sector pay next year, not across the board, but on a selective basis. And there'll be many difficult decisions of that type, both around spending and taxation in the future. But would my right honourable friend agree with me that in terms of dealing with the deficit, it's not just about spending and taxation, it's also very much about growth? And would he also agree with me that we should look to the private sector, businesses, entrepreneurs, to provide that growth? So could my right honourable friend set out how he's going to ensure that as we come out the other side of the crisis, business and entrepreneurs are given every possible support and freedom to power our economy forward over the years ahead?
Mr. Speaker, I completely agree with my right honourable friend. We will build our recovery through the dynamism of the private sector, and he's right about the power of entrepreneurship. I think the most important thing we probably can do when we think about that is to make it as easy as possible for businesses to take on new people. My honourable friend would have heard about the unemployment numbers. We want to get as many of those people back into work as quickly as possible, so we'll be thinking and looking at how we can make that as easy as possible for those dynamic businesses who are growing. At a very micro level, in this spending review, we also announced more funding for our startup loan scheme, which provides loans of discounted government-backed loans of up to £50,000 to budding entrepreneurs to start their new businesses at the smallest level, and I hope that's something that he will support.
We now come to the SNP Treasury spokesperson, Alison Poulos.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This spending review was an important opportunity and an important test. And instead of posing for photographs in his favourite hoodie, the Chancellor should have been listening to those who are struggling. £29 million for a festival of Brexit, while they let Waynes go hungry at home and abroad, just about sums this tawdry government up. Reneging in the 0.7% aid commitment while the world struggles in a COVID pandemic is just cruel. He says he's come to talk about jobs, but how many jobs has this Chancellor cost? Last month, the ONS reported that since March 2020, the number of payroll employees has fallen by 782,000. And how many job losses could have been avoided if the Chancellor had not wound back furlough and threatened to cut it short? I reported £1.4 billion for Job Centre Plus, so I asked the Chancellor, will he restore the job centres that were closed by his government in Scotland? And what about those who have been ignored, patched, blanked by the Chancellor at every turn, those excluded from his support schemes altogether? Many of those limited company directors, freelancers, short-term PAYE, new starters and those who were on maternity leave have had absolutely nothing at all from this UK government. He knows this and it's unjustifiable. He might have had some excuse back in March and April, but we are now in November. So I ask him, what does he expect these 3 million people to live on this winter? We'll look at the proposals for a director's income support scheme and the equity creatives support scheme. Many of those excluded are in jobs in sectors which cannot safely restart due to public health restrictions, so he must apologise and he must take action now to put it right. The Chancellor has spoken of the importance of getting young people into jobs, but he's utterly failed to address the reality of low-paid, part-time, precarious work. The Young Women's Trust, a staggering 1.5 million young women have lost income since the start of the pandemic. Many are in sectors such as retail and hospitality, which have been clobbered by COVID. What he should be announcing today is a real living wage. £9.50 an hour as set by the Living Wage Foundation, not his pretendy living wage. Now, I'm glad to see under 23s now eligible, but he said nothing about those who are 21, who are in the 21 to 24 bracket now and 8.20, the 18 to 20 and 6.45, the under 18 and 4.55 an hour, and the apprentices on merely £4.15 an hour. What about them? Mr Speaker, young people don't get a discount on their rent or their bills due to their age, but this Chancellor continues to shortchange them on wages. A fair wage for a day's work is the very least young people should expect from their government, and in acknowledging the injustice, the Chancellor fails to protect the rest of young people. Fair wages too for public sector workers, and it feels like the government's punishing people for working in the public sector. The absolute heroes who saw us through this pandemic have more than earned their pay. A public sector pay freeze takes £4 billion out of the economy, squeezes living standards and starves the economy of investment at the very worst possible time. The hospital porters, the teachers, the jannies, the police officers, the firefighters, those who've kept our streets clean and our public services going, all of them deserve better than applause on the Chancellor's doorstep in the summer and a pay freeze in the depths of winter. And not content with shortchanging young people and public sector workers, he wants to change RPI in a move that will impact around 10 million pension incomes and cost retirees over £100 billion. We on these benches urge him to see sense and not to pick the pockets of our pensioners. The Chancellor must also use this spending review to make the £20 uplift to universal credit permanent, to scrap the benefit cap, to extend the £20 uplift to legacy benefits and those with disabilities, for whose unfathomable reasons he seems to have forgotten even exist, and he must increase the pitiful level of statutory sick pay. Mr Speaker, businesses across the country have been racking up debt when their incomes have not been there. Businesses are terrified for the business rates relief coming to an end next year. So will he look at this issue so that we can also act in Scotland? Will he make the VAT cut to hospitality permanent to see them through this crisis? We still await details, proper details, of the Shared Prosperity Fund and what it will mean for Scotland. The Scottish Government has done its part in preparation, and the Chancellor needs to bring forward proposals as a matter of urgency so we can spend this money properly in Scotland rather than having it hide off to Tories in key seats in England. The spending review is only for 1 year, and I appreciate why that is, but this failure to plan effectively for the future is why the UK is doing worse in the G7. So I ask him, what are his plans for next year if things don't go as he expects? There is nothing in this Chancellor's statement about Brexit and the cost that that will bring when we see lorries queuing all the way through Kent. So we call on him also to make a £98 billion stimulus to invest in a greener, better future for us all. Mr Speaker, none of this has anything really to do with the strength of the Union, merely a reflection of the powers that he has as Chancellor, which the Scottish Government does not. So if he will not do these things, if he will not act, he must devolve the full financial powers and let the Scottish Government get on with the job.
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Let me run through those questions in turn from the Honourable Lady. I mean, she asked about my favourite hoodie. I can tell her it's not the one in the picture, but actually the Kickstart hoodie that was given to me by my right honourable friend, the Work and Pension Secretary, that I wear with pride. She asked about the self-employed, and again mentioned this number of 3 million people, which I'd like to actually address, Mr Speaker, properly. Now, at least it's not a number that I recognise, and I don't think it's right to describe those people as excluded. 1.5 million of that number are people who are not majority self-employed. Those are people who earn the majority of their income from being employed. Now, that was a decision that was taken to help target this support on those who really needed it. And we've heard a lot from the benches opposite about being targeted, especially with the self-employment scheme, and that was a decision that was made. Because if you earn the majority of your income from employment, it is reasonable to assume that you will benefit from the furlough scheme, and that's how the majority of your earnings come, Mr. Speaker. Now, that principle at the time was supported by every trade association that I spoke to in designing the scheme. And in fact, those conversations were supportive of a much higher threshold than the one that we adopted, which was just a majority, where others said 60%, two-thirds would be reasonable. But, Mr. Speaker, also, I hope it is of comfort to the House to know that those people, that 1.5 million people who are not majority self-employed, on average, the median amount of self-employment income that they have in their returns is somewhere between £2,000 and £3,000. So it is not the overwhelming part of their earnings, and at that level, the universal credit system and other support that we provide will be significant in making up the difference. She asked about welfare, and again mentioned universal credit. I guess, Mr. Speaker, it's worth, reminding the House that the Scottish Government has plenty of powers over tax policy, and indeed plenty of powers over welfare policy, and indeed has used them in the past. I hear there's to be a Scottish budget, and we will look forward to seeing what the Scottish Government decides to do with the powers that it has over both tax and welfare decisions. And then in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, she asked about jobs. And she talked about the OBR. I'm glad that the OBR today have also joined with the IMF and the Bank of England in commending the economic response of this government, and indeed recognising and stating explicitly that the interventions that we have put in place have reduced the level of unemployment, saved people's jobs. And indeed the OBR, I think, actually quantify that in their report today and put the number at hundreds of thousands, confirming what the IMF said, that our response has held down unemployment. And she asked about young people. Well, we are determined to help young people. They have borne the brunt economically of this crisis, which is why, in part, we created the Kickstart scheme, an ambitious programme, which now has, I think, 19,000 placements that have been accepted to create fully funded placements for those under the age of 24 who are at risk of unemployment. We also provide a cash bonus to businesses to take on new young apprentices, and I know, Mr. Speaker, that all of those things will make a difference to our young people at what is, without question, a very difficult time.
Proud of the House, Sir Peter Bottom.
The House will be glad that the Chancellor has met the needs of the poorest, that he's going to maintain the increase in the state pension, that he's making sure that people get opportunities to get back into work if they've been out of it. Can I ask him, when he talks about the £250 minimum for the poorest, lowest paid people in the public sector, whether that includes people working in local government or just national government? It'd be useful to know that. There'll be a welcome for the increase in spending in schools, and there are many other things which people think are sensible and could have been done or should have been done as the Labour government went through the crisis in 2008, when they also put a public sector pay freeze on. Can I put to him that it'd be incredible if IPSA forces a pay increase on members of Parliament when others don't get it? And one way or another, will government, and perhaps you, Mr. Speaker, talk with IPSA and make sure that does not happen? I have the view that MPs' pay should only be adjusted after a general election. That may be a minority view, but I think it'd be wrong for us to have pay forced on us when others can't get a pay increase. I'm going to turn, if I may, to the point of overseas aid. The Foreign Secretary, when the departments were merged, said the 0.7% figure was going to be maintained. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor, was elected in 2015, as I was, under a commitment to meet the 0.7%. We were re-elected in 2017, and the only difference to the commitment in 2019 is the word proudly was put in front of the commitment. I'm proud of that commitment. I will work with anyone across the House to make sure our change of percentage does not happen. Obviously, with our GNP coming down by 10%, the amount that goes on aid will come down automatically. I fight to maintain the pledge the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Foreign Secretary and I made at the last general election.
Just to say, I don't like being brought into the situation on pay. What I would say is there is no decision on pay. There is no award to MPs. There is a big mistake out there that somehow that there is an amount that's been given. Let me reassure the Father House that it's not the case. It won't even be looked at till next year, probably later into the odds Easter. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his thoughtful and powerful contribution, and I respect what he has to say on aid, and he's right about the language that was used, and he will know the extraordinary circumstances that this country and this government is grappling with, and in order for us to meet our many other commitments and deliver on the British people's priorities, we have had to make difficult decisions. It is something that, of course, I regret that we have to do, but I believe it is the right decision so that we can keep delivering on the priorities of the people at what is an enormously challenging time. May I turn to his other questions on local government employees? He will know that those pay levels are not mandated by central government, and local government will typically make its own decisions. With regard to social care workforce, which I know he also cares about, he will know many of those workers are on national living wage and they will benefit from the 2.2% uplift, £345 that we have accepted. And his last point, Mr. Speaker, I can tell him that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster has written on behalf of the government to its in advance of the statement, just to inform them of the government's approach to public sector pay and ask them to take that into consideration when they decide what they would like to do. Obviously, they are an independent body, but we have expressed our views in light of the pay policy that we have announced today.
We now head up to Edinburgh with Christine Jardine. Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I listened intently to the Chancellor, but what I didn't hear was enough. Enough to protect jobs by extending furlough to the summer. Enough for those in the public sector who've endured so much in this crisis and now will have a pay freeze. Or enough for those millions of families facing enormous financial hardship because they're excluded. And Chancellor, I point out to the Chancellor that they do exist. I can give him plenty of examples who phone my office every day in deep distress. So I would ask if the Chancellor can for a minute pause and put himself in the shoes of those 3 million excluded people, and then tell us why he still finds it acceptable to turn his back on them.
Mr. Speaker, I very much hope that the Honourable Labour will welcome the £2.4 billion in additional funding that's been provided to the Scottish Government to use as they see fit, and of course they can use that to support many of the causes that she articulated. I won't go over in the interest of time the answer I gave to the Honourable Lady from the SNP front bench, but we have provided comprehensive support to those who are self-employed. Between 2.5 and 3 million people have received £14 billion of support, with more to come. It remains one of the most generous ways to treat the self-employed that I've found anywhere in the world.
Boris Johnson.
I welcome this statement and the fact that the Chancellor recognises that debt has to be paid back. And can I ask the Chancellor about the changes in public sector pay? According to the ONS, private sector pay has fallen of late, whereas public sector pay has gone up by about 4%. So the Chancellor's announcement today that the 2 million public sector workers who are the lowest paid will receive £250 shows, does it not, that they are our priority, they are the people that need this most, and they are the people that we will give attention to.
Chancellor.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. A situation in which a majority of those working in the public sector next year see an increase in their pay. It would be wrong to describe that situation as a blanket pay freeze. We have done exactly as my honourable friend suggested. We have targeted our resources on those who need it most, meaning that over 2.1 million people who earn less than £24,000 in the public sector, who comprise 38% of all of those in the public sector, will see that increase of £250 or more in their pay packets.
Geoffrey Donaldson.
We welcome the additional £900 million for the Northern Ireland Executive, yet again a benefit of Northern Ireland being part of this United Kingdom. And I think we all believe that nurses, doctors and healthcare workers should receive a decent pay rise. But will the Chancellor acknowledge that there are other public sector workers who've been on the front line on COVID, such as our armed forces and our police officers? And will he look again at including them in the public sector pay rise? And of course, I agree with the Father of the House, that should not include members of Parliament.
Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm glad and I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for welcoming the £900 million in Barnet for Northern Ireland. He'll be pleased to know we've had productive conversations about fixing some technical baseline issues for the budgeting as well, which I know will be welcomed by the Executive. And with regard to pay, we are protecting those who earn less than the UK median salary in whichever sector they work of the public sector. If someone earns less than £24,000, they will receive the £250. And I think that's the right approach, Mr. Speaker, is to provide that support to those on lower than average earnings.
David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I add my support to everything said by the Father of the House? Now, COVID-19 means the Chancellor's strategy is broken into 3 phases. The first one, which we're doing now, spending everything necessary to stop the economy collapsing, which he is doing very successfully. Secondly, essentially from next spring, doing everything possible to maximise growth and recovery in the economy. And thirdly, after that, when things get onto an even keel, returning to conventional economics. Does the Chancellor agree that the enormous deficits inevitably created in both Phase 1 and Phase 2 of his strategy need to be financed in a similar way to major incidents like wars with very long-term bonds, not destructive short-term taxes?
Chancellor?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend's comments. Just to distinguish 2 things, the borrowing that we are carrying out this year, which is, as he knows, a peacetime high, is financed through the gilt markets. He'll be pleased to know that we do push as much as we can to the long end of the curve, and relative to our international peers, the average maturity of our debt stock is around 14 or 15 years, almost double the average of the G7. So he's right that we should do that. But I would differentiate that from an ongoing structural deficit, which is with us for many years. And as he said, our first priority coming out of this will be to get growth going again.
Diolch,
Mr. Speaker. On average, Wales received £400 million a year from EU structural investment funds, sadly well above the UK per capita average due to our greater relative need. Promises have been made that Wales will receive not a penny less from the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. Now, the Chancellor has stated that he will match total UK funding, but can he also confirm that Wales's share will not be diminished, that it will represent additional investment, and that the fund will be allocated according to need?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, what we have said is as the EU funding that we are currently financing runs off, we will step in and replace that funding up to the tune of about £1.5 billion. That is the UK amount. Obviously, there's conversations about how best to allocate that, what kinds of projects, how it should be done, are a conversation to be had. There are some initial thoughts on that published today, alongside some funding of over £200 million to start piloting those approaches, working with communities to see what works best. And I know that people in Wales will welcome that, and I look forward to seeing what proposals they come up with.
No, Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Chancellor is quite right that people want to look back and see their communities better off before. And if I can pick up on the shared prosperity point, Corbyn's received European funding, and the shared prosperity fund has been promised to us. But it's very difficult in an area where the population isn't so large, isn't so great, to demonstrate value for money to Treasury, and as a result, we miss out. So as the Chancellor sets out more on the Levelling Up Fund and Shared Prosperity Fund, wages in Cornwall still remain stubbornly low. Will the Chancellor reassure me that the Levelling Up Fund and Shared Prosperity Fund will work to address these low wages, will provide the good jobs, improved skills, and the pathway to the skills and the opportunities that people need in Cornwall?
Chancellor.
Well, I commend my honourable friend because he consistently comes to this House to champion his constituents and talk about increasing the opportunities available to them. And he's right. We want to make sure that we target our resources at the places where they can make the most difference. And I look forward to hearing from him what projects he thinks will be able to transform the lives of his constituents and the communities that they are proud to call home.
Let's head down to Blank Pavilion with Caroline Lucas. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor speaks of the fiscal emergency, but not a word today about the climate and nature emergencies. And there's a real risk that any green steps will be fatally undermined by the reckless pursuit of business as usual, environmentally destructive spending, like the £27 billion road building programme. Now, the Chancellor himself has said there can be no lasting prosperity for people if we don't protect the planet. So will he adopt a new economic rule, a net zero test, and assess all spending and fiscal measures against the UK's climate and nature goals, so the whole package is properly green?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this government firmly believes in making sure that our recovery is green. I'd urge the Honourable Lady to have a look at the National Infrastructure Strategy, which we've published today, the title Fairer, Faster, Greener, which outlines all the funding for all the green measures contained in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. I think it represents a comprehensive and ambitious path to deliver our net zero commitments.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I thank my right honourable friend for his courtesy over the weekend and assure him of my very strong support for virtually all of his package today. As a result of the pandemic here in the UK, 50,000 people have died, and we are rightly moving heaven and earth to prevent more deaths here at home. But is he aware that his proposed breaking of the 0.7 promise and the 30% further reduction in cash will be the cause of 100,000 preventable deaths, mainly among children? This is a choice I, for one, am not prepared to make. And none of us in this House will be able to look our children in the eye and claim we did not know what we were voting for.
Mr. Speaker, I'm enormously grateful to my right honourable friend for the conversations that I've been able to have with him, and I fully respect his passion on this subject, and he brings an enormous amount of experience to this House on this topic. Obviously, he will have heard the reasons that I set out for doing what we're doing. I believe we can still make a difference to the world's poorest countries with the measures that we've put in place. I think the most pressing issue that the developing world faces at the moment is the ability to deliver and deploy a coronavirus vaccine. He will know that we are the largest donor globally to the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment, the global initiative which is supporting development countries' access to vaccines. I think right now it's probably the most important thing we could be doing. We are doing it. We are leading the world in helping them tackle coronavirus, but I know he and I will carry on this conversation.
Let's head to North Down with Stephen Farry. Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID pandemic has exposed structural weaknesses in our economy and society. It would also likely to accelerate changes in terms of how people work, live and interact. And can also point out to the Chancellor that the excluded is a genuine problem. And one of the difficulties is that the government are not counting those who are directors of limited companies, sole directors, as part of the self-employed, which is how the figures are coming across confusing. But can I ask the Chancellor, does he accept that public spending should not essentially assume a restoration of the status quo ante? It has to be based on a transformation of our society and our economy around social justice, inclusion, reskilling and investment in a Green New Deal.
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd say to the honourable gentleman, we do want our recovery to be green, and as I said, the National Infrastructure Strategy, I think, sets out an ambitious way to do that. And skills are at the heart of what we believe, Mr. Speaker, giving people the tools they need to improve their lives and go on to better things. We have funded £375 million today to deliver our commitments on the Prime Minister's Lifetime Skills Guarantee and others, and he can rest assured it remains an area of enormous focus for this government.
Let's head to Bosworth with Dr. Luke Evans. Dr. Luke Evans.
In light of the difficulties the country faces with its finances, I was pleased to see the commitment to infrastructure. But practically, is he aware of the bridge, Hinckley Bridge on the A5, which has been awarded the most bashed bridge in Britain? It's been hit 25 times and causes a delay of 6 hours every time. This is a prime example of pinch points littered up and down the A5, which strangles productivity. So will he commit to providing funds to the likes of the A5 to bring prosperity to the Midlands and grow our economy out of the COVID situation?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think my honourable friend it articulates well an example of local pinch points being a blight on communities, stopping people from improving the quality of their life and driving growth. And it seems like a very good example of the type of project that our new Levelling Up Fund would be interested in, and I look forward to discussing it with him further.
Let's head up to Islington North to Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout the corona crisis, public sector workers in all areas have delivered brilliantly and helped to save lives and look after all of our communities. Civil servants have lost 19% in wages over the past 10 years due to austerity. There is a 12% gender pay gap that affects civil servants. So will the Chancellor recognise the importance of their work and their participation. Give an increase of 10% to begin to make up the ground that they lost over the past 10 years. And instead of saying to them that as thanks for all their work, they're going to get a maximum of £5 a week for the lowest paid, instead return to proper national pay bargaining for all civil servants so that those people that deliver for us are seen to be treated properly and fairly as we come out of the corona crisis.
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the right honourable gentleman gives me an opportunity to thank my fantastic team of civil servants in the Treasury who have been extraordinary in their hard work and creativity throughout this crisis and have remained so over the past few weeks, concluding the spending review. So I put on record my thanks to them. Unsurprisingly, my numbers are slightly different to those of the honourable gentleman. According to the ONS, before this crisis even started in 2019, there existed at least a 7% pay premium between the public and private sectors after accounting for characteristics and pensions. That gap, no doubt, has been exacerbated and widened over the last 6 to 12 months as a result of a widening pay inequality between public and private sector pay. And that's why I believe it is fair to take the approach we have done. But I do share with the honourable gentleman a desire to protect those on lower incomes, which is why those 2.1 million people who earn less than £24,000 will receive a pay rise of £250.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Chancellor for having to make some very difficult decisions, but as President-elect Biden commits to a new era of Western leadership, here we are about to mark the start of our G7 presidency by cutting our overseas aid budget. Downgrading our soft power programs will leave vacuums in some of the poorest parts of the world that will further poverty and instability. And is likely to see China and indeed Russia extending their authoritarian influence by taking our place. Would my right honourable friend concede we cannot genuinely claim to be global Britain, nor serious about creating post-conflict strategies for countries like Libya and Yemen that could lead to greater UK prosperity when our hard power is not matched by our soft power? Would he agree to meet with me to discuss how these dated rules governing overseas aid should be updated?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, I'm sure, will welcome the very significant increase in our defence budget. I know it's something that he has campaigned for to fix many of the issues of the past. And he also knows and alluded to the ability for us to help lots of different parts of the world in lots of different ways. And Libya was one example he gave. He will know that we are the 5th largest contributor to the UN's peacekeeping operations. And on his point about rules, he does make a good point. For example, we spend about £500 million every year, Mr. Speaker, on peacekeeping and security operations in countries like Libya, Mali, Somalia, Sudan, the DRC. That type of spending, that type of difference we make on the ground, that type of security that we bring to some of the world's poorest places is not currently counted as ODA.
West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor has spoken well today of the scars that are currently being felt by so many in society due to the triple whammy of COVID, climate change and Brexit. Will he outline within the health spend how he will manage to ring-fence money for mental health? Mind, the charity, has said that there has been a doubling of phone calls, many young people experiencing debilitating anxiety, depression, self-harm. Will he urgently look at mental health and ring-fence money for workforce changes which are desperately needed and for a decent revenue spend to bring mental health up into line with physical health?
Chancellor.
I think the Honourable Lady makes a good point, and I'm pleased to tell her that of the £3 billion of extra money for the NHS that we've announced for next year to help recover from coronavirus, of that £500 million is specifically earmarked to address waiting times in mental health services, give people the support they need, and invest in the workforce that she rightly identified. I hope that gives her some reassurance, and that is incremental to the existing NHS plans.
Video link. Pauline Latham.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I wish to congratulate the Chancellor on how he's handled the financial pressures which the pandemic has thrown at the government by thinking outside of the box with brilliant, innovative solutions. However, I cannot support the new tiering system because it's totally illogical and will force too many people to stay holed up at home. Hospitality businesses will fold in their tens of thousands, and I cannot condone this when they've spent tens of thousands becoming COVID safe. I will also not support the reduction in the aid budget. This country has made an amazing difference to the lives of millions, but with the reduction of GNI and the proposed cut, the aid budget will be decimated. No longer will girls have 12 years of quality education, resulting in more child marriages, more instances of early childbirth, more FGM, more domestic violence. We will not be vaccinating millions, preventing polio, TB, providing medication for HIV or preventing malaria. We will be reduced spending on humanitarian crises in emergencies only.
Pauline, please, could we just have a question?
Yes, so many things will be damaged and our relations with the developing world will lose its soft influence that we have today. I cannot condone this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and therefore I will not be supporting this statement.
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Honourable Lady makes a passionate case and a right case for our ability to help provide immunisation to the world's poorest children. It's something that I proudly support, and Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to tell the House that we are the largest donor to the Gavi consortium globally of any country in the world, and that is the multilateral body that provides immunisation against infectious diseases for 75 million children. As I said, we are proudly the largest donor to that effort.
Can I just remind members, please, let's not have a speech and eventually a question. Can we get quickly to the questions in order that we can get everybody in? Angela Eagle.
Well, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In this COVID crisis, the government has presided over an horrific double whammy of one of the largest per capita death rates in the world and the deepest recession in the G7, and that's before the Brexit disruption due at the end of the year. Is the Chancellor really proud of his record?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, my priority throughout this crisis has been protecting jobs. I'm pleased to see that that is something that the OBR, the Bank of England and the IMF all acknowledge has happened as a result of our interventions. We currently have an unemployment rate that is lower than Italy, France, Spain, Canada and the United States. So yes, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do think what we're doing is making a difference to millions of people up and down the country.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I commend all the work the Chancellor's done this year? Many constituents I speak to credit him personally with keeping them in a job. And I'm also pleased to see, despite the financial pressures, the Chancellor's investing in transport. We see multi-year settlements for road, rail and active travel, changes to the way infrastructure projects are appraised to increase the number of transport projects in deprived parts of the country in the Green Book, a national infrastructure strategy, a Red Book and a £4 billion Levelling Up Fund. And I'm pleased to see the DfT as a sponsor. Can I ask him to keep a watchful eye on how this is all spent? And can I also ask him to continue to place transport investment at the heart of our recovery and his long-term vision for this country?
Yeah, well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful for my honourable friend's intervention. He's absolutely right and has championed on this tirelessly for his constituents and the country about the importance of transport in our levelling up agenda and helping to drive growth and spread opportunity. He's also right that we should be careful about how this money is spent and make sure it's delivered. I talked about Project Speed earlier. I will welcome his involvement in that and advice, and also he will notice in the spending review document a new focus on outcomes across public services with a new public value framework. Again, this is something that will deliver what he's asking for.
Video link. Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
I'm grateful, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I raise with the Chancellor the issue of statutory sick pay? Even before the crisis hit earlier this year, it's always been the case that statutory sick pay in the United Kingdom hasn't been comparable to other similar advanced economies. Sitting at only £95, we know that it's not enough for those who need it for self-isolation, and that it's estimated to make up only about a fifth of workers' wages. So can I ask the Chancellor to look at building up the statutory sick pay mechanisms that we have in this country so that it's fit not just for the times we're in now, but the hard times people are going to face in future, and give workers the proper financial security they deserve and are lacking in right now.
Chancellor.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, at the beginning of this crisis, we made changes to the way that statutory sick pay operates, making sure that it was payable from day one rather than day 4, and for those who are self-employed, making changes to the way universal credit, ESA, and the minimum income floor work, all to enable some of the things that the Honourable Gentleman mentioned. It's also worth bearing in mind that on the last survey evidence we have, a majority, I think something north of 60% of people get more than statutory sick pay as a result of the treatment from their employers.
Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I recognise that the Chancellor will have made the decision on 0.7% with an extremely heavy heart. But does he recognise that the respect felt for this country around the world is because we have championed causes throughout our history that matter to people everywhere, like democracy, human rights, and the rule of law? And one of those causes is tackling extreme poverty. So to cut our aid budget by a third in a year when millions more will fall into extreme poverty will make not just them poorer, but us poorer in the eyes of the world, because people will worry that we are abandoning a noble ideal that we in this country have done more to champion than anyone else.
Chancellor.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's with enormous grateful thanks to the Honourable Gentleman for the way he's approached us, and I appreciate the conversations he's had with me on this topic. Of course, he rightly feels passionately about it. I would say to him, and he knows this better than anywhere, one, there are many ways in which we exert our influence and our values across the world. Aid is just but one part, and even on that, at 0.5%, we will still be more generous as a percentage of GDP than all our major economy peers, almost all: France, Japan, Canada, Italy, the United States, the average of the OECD, and the values that he cares deeply about, I also care deeply about, and I look forward to talking with him further about how best we can express those values and make a difference to those who need our help everywhere that we find them.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Charities up and down the land will wonder why the Chancellor has abandoned them today. Already accumulated £10 billion of debt, 20% of our charities could fold, despite the extraordinary work they've done for our nation during this pandemic. Now I read his book, his statement, which says there's going to be further rationing in the Office of Civil Society. Will he go away and reflect and come back to that dispatch box with real money to support our valuable charities?
Mr. Speaker, I think almost uniquely during this crisis amongst other countries, we've provided enormous financial support to our charity sector, £750 million that the Department for Culture, Media and Sport has distributed to small and large charities up and down the country, because they do fantastic work. It has been a difficult time for them, and that's why this government, at a time of acute crisis, stood behind them.
Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. On the 26th of February, I asked the Prime Minister to offer additional support to Wales over and above the devolved settlement in the face of unprecedented flooding caused by Storm Dennis. The Prime Minister at the dispatch box gave an assurance that, in his words, he would passport funding to Wales. 9 months later, with winter approaching, we still have not had that delivered. So can I ask the Chancellor what discussions he has had on this issue and when he feels the government will be able to deliver on the Prime Minister's promises to Welsh communities?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I believe we have, with £1.3 billion of extra funding next year for the Welsh Government to spend as it sees fit on its devolved competencies, of which, of course, flooding is one, and I'm sure that that's something he can raise with the Welsh Government. We, in England, are doubling the amount of investment in flood defences over the next few years to over £5 billion, protecting over 300,000 homes, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But as I said, the £1.3 billion of Barnett funding for Wales will enable that funding to go to where it's needed.
Sir Robert Sims.
Can I thank the Chancellor for his statement? Over the last 10 years, we've spent over £100 billion on overseas aid, a lot of it borrowed. Most of my constituents will understand the difficult decision the government had to make. On 0.5, we're higher than most of our neighbours, but probably higher than the major government and many other governments in the past. As he set out the recovery in GDP and growth over the next 3 or 4 years, no doubt the budget will also go up again.
Chancellor.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his comment. He is right, and I think he's right to point out, I think the average of the last Labour government was 0.36%, so it will be sufficiently ahead of that. And as I said, this is something that we intend to return to over time when the fiscal situation allows. He will appreciate better than others the unbelievable uncertainty at the moment that exists, but that is our intention.
Video link. Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Could I first of all declare an interest in this question, as I suffer from myeloma, a form of blood cancer. Could I say to the Chancellor, we all recognise and applaud the incredible work that the NHS and its staff have done for all of us in the last few months. Would he recognise, however, that in terms of the future, much of research for cancer is funded by charitable donations? Those donations have fallen significantly during the recent months for obvious reasons that everyone can understand. So could I say to him, in order to make sure treatments do continue to improve in the future, will he agree to fully fund cancer research to make up that difference in charitable donations, at least for the next few years?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman's question, and I know it's a topic on which he speaks passionately. He'll be pleased to know more generally about our record spending on R&D next year of just shy of £15 billion. The exact allocation obviously is something for the Department for Business, but there's a significant increase in there for basic research. But also within the DHSC budget settlement, about £1.3 billion to fund research for the National Institute of Health Research and Genomics England, both of which I think do a fantastic job, and I'm sure will be working to develop treatments for all of us in the years to come.
John Penrose.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, can I welcome the Chancellor's continuing commitment to sound money? It's particularly easy to forget in a year when we've just seen an 11.3% cut in the size of the economy, that ultimately all the money that we're borrowing has eventually to be paid back by us as taxpayers. So can I urge him not to lose that focus, and as soon as is possible to get back to a sustainable basis? And as part of that, could he say more about the Restart programme, which he mentioned earlier on, a crucial thing to try and get members of the long-term unemployed back into work? How many people does he expect that to help, and what benefit does he expect that to have for our long-term sustainable economy?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, as ever, my honourable friend speaks fantastically good sense. He is right, we will need to return to a sustainable fiscal position, not least to build resilience for whatever the next crisis or shock that comes along, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We want to be able to react in the same comprehensive and generous way that we did this time, and that requires us to have a strong set of public finances going into it. And he's right about the Restart programme. That will help, we think, around 1 million of those who are long-term unemployed. It will be an exciting and ambitious programme, and the Institute of Employment Studies has spoken, I think, very well about the evidence there is for this kind of high-quality, individual, work-focused approach, making an enormous difference in getting people back into work. If we can do that, we can reduce some of the long-term scarring that they will face. So I have high hopes for what this programme can achieve.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all welcome the £900 million which will be available to the Northern Ireland Executive, and I think that it's a reminder to the people of Northern Ireland of the economic security which we have as being part of the United Kingdom, and also the consequences for Wales and Scotland should be a reminder to people there as well of the benefits of the Union. Could I just ask the Chancellor one thing about the Levelling Up Fund, the Infrastructure Bank, and also the Shared Prosperity Fund? When will he have the details of access to that, and can he assure us that the access to all of those funds will be equally available to different parts of the United Kingdom?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can give the honourable gentleman that assurance. These are UK-wide programmes, and we hope to have more details about the Infrastructure Bank in the spring, so it can get up and running, at least in shadow form, as quickly as possible, and making a difference to communities all around the United Kingdom.
Mark Pawsey.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. May I first of all join my honourable friends in expressing concern about the proposal to reduce overseas aid, but welcome today's announcements, in particular on infrastructure, apprenticeships and research and development, which will create wealth and jobs. And can I also welcome the very substantial support that the Chancellor has provided to help businesses and people get through coronavirus. But my constituents know that these measures will all have to be paid for. So can he assure them that when this economic emergency is over, he will return to a policy of balancing the books?
Chancellor.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Although it's right to act in this way during the crisis, it wouldn't be a sustainable way to operate. But the important thing to know is right now the focus should be on supporting business and jobs. But once our economic recovery is secure, we can turn our task to making sure that we have a strong set of public finances.
John Cryer.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor has announced a pay freeze for hundreds of thousands of public sector workers today who don't deserve it. Firefighters, care assistants, teaching assistants, all will suffer a pay freeze. What is the economic impact, the assessment of the economic impact of that pay freeze? There must be one in the Treasury somewhere. What is it?
Mr Speaker, I think it would be wrong to describe a blanket pay freeze for this policy, where a majority of those working in the public sector will see an increase in their pay next year, either because they earn less than the UK median salary of £24,000, or they work in the NHS, or indeed that they're on the national living wage. Across all of those areas, there'll be a pay increase that will benefit millions of people and, of course, make a difference to the economy.
Laura Farris.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome the significant financial commitment to mental health services. One of the striking takeaways in my constituency is the proliferation in anxiety, depression and sometimes addiction that is emerging from the crisis. We know that these have a pernicious correlation with long-term unemployment. And for that reason, could I invite my right honourable friend to keep a sharp focus on mental health spending over the years ahead, because the best training programmes, the best labour market interventions in the world will only work if the workforce is mentally well enough to engage.
Well, I think my honourable friend makes an excellent point. It's a topic she knows very well, and I hope she was heartened to hear what I said earlier about £500 million of the increase of £3 billion for the NHS this year being specifically targeted on mental health to address all the things she said, and she's right about the difference they will make to many people in our country.
Darren Jones.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Over 4 million children are in poverty in the UK, and the successive Conservative Chancellors' Sure Start centres have closed, child trust funds have been slashed, nurseries today are on the brink of collapse, and the number of children falling into poverty increases month after month, an unnecessary national tragedy. So why, especially at these difficult times, could the Chancellor not today commit to eradicating child poverty in his economic statement? Chancellor.
Mr Deputy Speaker, on the last numbers, there are 100,000 fewer children in absolute poverty than in 2010, and 750,000 fewer children living in workless households than in 2010. He asked about nurseries in early years. He'll be pleased to know there was above inflation increase in the hourly rate for nursery providers contained in this spending review.
Video link. Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. A few months ago, the party opposite was clapping public sector workers. Now it's cutting the pay of millions. This crisis shouldn't be paid for on the backs of the working class, but it is. Over 2 million people are now paid less than the minimum wage, up fivefold. Sick pay so low, people are forced to choose between their health and putting food on the table. And millions of people's benefits, largely sick and disabled people, will rise by just 37 pence a week. Instead of forcing millions into poverty, will the Chancellor impose a windfall tax on those who have made super profits from this crisis?
Well, Mr Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman talked about those on the lowest pay. I mean, we've increased or accepted the recommendations from the Low Pay Commission to increase the national living wage by 2.2%. That will make a difference of £345 to full-time national living wage workers, as well as protecting those in the public sector who earn up to the average UK salary of £24,000, who will receive a fixed or £250 uplift.
Video link. John Barron.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I commend the Chancellor for many of these measures, including the support for the lower paid. And when it comes to funding them, I encourage him not to stifle enterprise through increases in taxes, as these are often counterproductive. But may I raise with him today the case of social care workers? They provide an essential service, but they are often overlooked, in part because they span the private and public sectors. What more can he do for them? For example, further to my letter to him, will he consider raising their personal tax threshold so they can take home more of their pay?
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd say to my honourable friend, he's right about the importance of social care workers. He'll know that they're not formally part of public sector pay settlements, but many of them are national living wage workers, as he knows, so they will benefit from the increase that we're putting in place for next year of 2.2%. And he will know that we have already in the budget made starts on our desire to increase the national insurance threshold up, delivering cash benefits of I think about £100 this year to people, but it's something that we of course will keep under review for future fiscal events.
Video link. Martin Day.
Thank you, Madam Deputy. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor has already allowed UK unemployment to rise to 4.8% and expects it to rise further, with redundancies at a record high. Will he now admit his mistake in leaving the 3 million without furlough or self-employed help scheme and give contractors, freelancers, creatives and others the help that they so desperately deserve?
Chancellor. Well, Mr. Speaker, the OBR and others have said that our economic interventions have helped keep down unemployment and protected jobs, and that is part of the reason why our unemployment rate today is lower than Italy, France, Spain, Canada and the United States.
Philip Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I support the Chancellor's decision to cut the overseas aid budget, which I think will be widely welcomed across the country and the real world, even if not always in here? I don't see why it should be controversial to say that we should only spend what we can afford on overseas aid, and I suspect that the vast majority of the British public won't be asking why has he cut so much. They will probably be asking why are we still spending so much. And if some of that money he's saving can be spent on the much needed and long awaited Shipley Eastern bypass and some proper flood defences in the Shipley constituency, then so much the better.
Chancellor. I thank my honourable friend for his support, and he makes an important point. This spending review is about delivering on the British people's priorities. And yes, we have made some tough choices, but we have done that so that we can continue investing in the things that our constituents value most. And I look forward to talking to him further about the bypass and flooding defences that he needs. But hopefully with the doubling of our flood defences over this Parliament, it is something that we can make progress on for him.
Steve Double.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all place on record my thanks to the Chancellor for the recent announcement of support for airports, which has been very welcome, and also just thank him for the way that he is approaching this in a very measured and sensible way, the unprecedented challenges we're facing. But can I just raise the challenges facing the hospitality sector? This sector has been impacted more than any other, and although the government have provided incredible support in recent months, they are facing real challenges this winter with the restrictions that we are placing on them. They say that 94% of businesses in Tier 3 will be unviable, 74% in Tier 2, and even in Tier 1, 30% of businesses are likely to be unviable. They have played an incredible part in our growth and job creation over the last 10 years and want to continue doing that as we recover from this crisis. So can he please look at again at what support we can give to this sector to make sure they're still around in the spring to help our recovery?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend, as ever, is a passionate champion for the hospitality sector, and he's right to be so. They employ 2 million people, often lower paid, and they have been hit harder than almost anybody by this crisis, which is why, as he acknowledged, we have put in place unprecedented support through VAT cuts, initiatives over the summer, Eat Out to Help Out, business rates holidays, and now cash grants when those businesses are either closed or in Tier 2 areas facing restrictions to help get them through the winter. Those grants, I think, in general, will equate to the rental payment that most of those businesses have. We have that information. That's the single biggest fixed cost of a hospitality business. And of course, they can furlough their staff. I know it's difficult. Hopefully those interventions will make a difference, because he's right. We want them to be able to bounce back strongly.
Lillian Greenwood.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Midlands Engine has identified priorities for investment as transport, digital connectivity and energy. That's what we need to enable the Midlands and the UK to recover from this pandemic, to build back bigger, better and greener. But according to the IFS, the East Midlands has suffered the lowest level of transport spending per person since 2014-15. We've also been at the back of the queue for all capital spending for at least 5 years. So if he's serious about levelling up, can he guarantee that the East Midlands will receive the highest allocation of any region when he hands out his new Levelling Up Fund?
Chancellor. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady, I think, talked about a few different things, transport and digital connectivity being among the most important to her region, and I think this is a spending review that delivers on both of those priorities, with record amount of spending on road, on rail, on intracity transportation, on buses, on cycling, but also on digital connectivity, with our plans to bring 85% of the country to gigabit capable broadband by 2025, and indeed deliver on the green plan that I outlined. I'm very look forward to hearing from her in her local areas once we launch the Levelling Up Fund, because I'm sure there will be projects that we can make a difference to.
Video link. David Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I welcome the Levelling Up Fund. A project that I've been championing since the outset is the Eden North project. Would the Chancellor meet with me to discuss the Eden project in Morecambe this coming shortly, as this is exactly the kind of shovel-ready project that would level up not just Morecambe, but the whole of our region?
Did the Chancellor get that?
Yes. Mr. Deputy Speaker, yes. I think it was something about the Eden project, but I'd be very happy to meet with my honourable friend and discuss his ambitions for his area and this project. I know he's put a lot of thought and energy into it, as has his community, and I very much hope we can make progress over the coming years.
Richard Fuller.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, in his statement, my right honourable friend said, "The spending announced today is secondary to the courage, wisdom, kindness and creativity it unleashes. These are the incalculable but essential parts of our future, and they cannot be mandated or distributed by government." Mr. Deputy Speaker, he is right in that, and the private sector and businesses will respond to what he has announced today. But may I ask my right honourable friend, when it comes to consideration of taxes, will he look to protect the incentives for those who invest and grow such businesses?
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for his comment. He's absolutely right, and from his own business experience, he knows this well. And he will know one of the things we do to incentivise entrepreneurship through the tax system is our world-leading EIS and SEIS programmes, which provide significant support to private investors to help fund new businesses. We've expanded that scheme over time, and I know he has thoughts on it, and I look forward to hearing them.
Venu Mishra.
Mr. Speaker, I refer the House to my entry in the Register of Members' Financial Interest. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the taxpayer support for British businesses and jobs during this pandemic has been a lifeline for many. But today we hear that Rolls-Royce, which has benefited handsomely from the public purse, whilst moving highly skilled jobs abroad, intends to shut down its historic Barnoldswick site until after Christmas and offshore the work to Japan, Singapore and Spain, in a clear attempt to break the current industrial action there. Does the Chancellor agree that this kind of bully boy strike-busting tactics are utterly unacceptable, and that all financial support must be immediately withdrawn until Rolls-Royce comes to its senses, ends its lockout and gets back to the table with the United Union to resolve this dispute?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know the aerospace industry has been suffering a particularly difficult time over the past few months, and that has impacted businesses like Rolls and others up and down the supply chain. We have put some measures in place to help airports and indeed get people flying again and enjoy conversations with specific companies all the time. But I'd urge all companies to work constructively with their workforces through what is a difficult period and hopefully find resolution. Collectively, we are all trying to protect jobs, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but it is, of course, a very challenging set of circumstances.
Steve Bryan.
Thank you, sir. The £325 million for the NHS to invest in the new diagnostic kits really welcome, as will be the £1 billion to begin tackling this elective backlog caused by COVID. So can I ask the Chancellor to stick with that, and what freedoms my NHS Trust will have to spend that money? Because my constituents waiting for the NEOP or the HIP-HOP, it may not be life or death issues, but they're massively life-impacting issues that then prevent them from getting on with their lives, working, enjoying their children or grandchildren. So I'm just asking to stick with that and clear this backlog.
Well, my honourable friend, of course, knows about this particularly well from his own experience, and he's right. And this is one of the implications of the lockdown and what we've done in the past, that we do have this backlog now, and he's right, it does make a difference to people's day-to-day quality of life, which is why we've provided $3 billion, of which $1 billion is to tackle exactly the elective backlog. It'll enable 1 million more scans and treatments to happen, and as I said, it's something that we should stick with.
Video link. Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Over 1 million 1950s-born WASPy women remain in the workforce, including in front-facing roles. Many had planned to retire but can't because the Chancellor's government hit them with a lengthy delay in accessing their pensions. WASPy women have asked me why the Chancellor can't sort out their pensions, allowing them to retire and freeing up their jobs for others. That would be a win-win for the Chancellor and WASPy women. Will he look to do that?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, of course, that case has been, I think, settled in the courts. There's not much further I can add, but today we have announced an uplift of 2.5% for 12 million pensioners on the state pension, which I know will make a difference to many.
Ben Everett.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the Chancellor shares my vision that Milton Keynes and the wider Thames Valley can be the Silicon Valley of Europe. And at this point, we know that 88% of UK companies are currently experiencing a lack of digital skills, and this is costing our economy £63 billion a year. So can I therefore ask whether the proposal for a brand new STEM-focused science and digital technology university in Milton Keynes would be eligible to apply for funding from the new £4 billion pot for levelling up?
Chancellor.
Mr Deputy Speaker, we'll publish further details on how the Levelling Up Fund will work in due course. It's for those smaller, deliverable, everyday infrastructure projects that I talk about. But my honourable friend is absolutely right to champion technology and innovation and digital adoption by SMEs. He'll be pleased to know the spending review confirms just over £50 million to support BEIS to deliver productivity-enhancing improvements for SMEs, and one of those I think does involve use of digital technology, which is something the UK lags behind peers in.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We know that families are really struggling right now. The Bank of England has said that inflation forecast next year is 2%. So can he guarantee that the 2.1 million public sector workers he referred to won't face a real terms pay cut next year? And can he explain why on earth he is still going ahead with the appalling £1,000 cut in universal credit that will hit millions of families across the country at this incredibly difficult time?
Chancellor.
Mr Speaker, for those in the public sector who earn less than £24,000, which is the UK national median wage, they will receive at least a fixed increase of £250. That's 2.1 million people, 38% of the workforce, and well, it would depend on the exact salary that they make, Mr Speaker, but it's a fixed £250 for all of those 2 million workers.
Video link. Nigel Mills.
I welcome much of the statement, and I look forward to sending him the bid for the Ripley-Codnor bypass. Will you be able to offer any encouragement to the supply chain of the hospitality industry? He's supporting the restaurants and pubs that are closed, but not those important businesses that supply them that also can't trade if they've got no customers to sell to.
Chancellor.
Mr Deputy Speaker, obviously those businesses will be able to use the furlough scheme on its generous terms through the winter period for their staff, but also the over £1 billion of funding that we made available to local authorities before the start of the latest national restrictions was there to support businesses and their local economy in the way that they saw fit throughout the winter period. So of course that funding is available at a local level to perhaps do some of the things that the honourable gentleman talked about.
Nick Whitley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Chancellor has promised the British people a green jobs revolution, but the UK is fast falling behind countries like France and Germany. We need investments in jobs of the future now. What immediate steps will the Chancellor be taking to support green infrastructure projects such as offshore wind and emerging tidal projects and green jobs in Merseyside?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I don't believe we are behind France and Germany. We're phasing out ICE vehicles 10 years before France is, and we're phasing out coal 13 years before Germany is. And indeed, the Prime Minister's 10-point plan will support up to 250,000 green jobs, building on the progress we've made, being the country that has decarbonised the fastest out of all major economies.
Anthony Bryan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My constituency is home to the global headquarters of AstraZeneca, the private sector company that's committed to producing, on a not-for-profit basis, the so-called Oxford vaccine, not just for the British population, but for developing countries around the world. It's doing that through Gavi, the Global Vaccines Alliance, of which the UK, as the Chancellor said earlier, is the biggest financial supporter. Coronavirus, the pandemic, is the biggest crisis facing the world, and the UK is in a leading position tackling it. Can my right honourable friend confirm that as a result of this spending review, the UK will continue to be able to play that leading role against the pandemic?
Chancellor. I can give my honourable friend that assurance, and he highlights a perfect example of this country making enormous difference to millions of people around the world, not just with our aid budget, but through the quality of our research and then our desire to find commercial partners who would bring that life-saving treatment to millions of people at cost. I think it's a fantastic example, and my honourable friend is right to highlight it.
Video link. Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It was frankly opprobrious that there was nothing today to help the 3 million people excluded from government support schemes. They are desperate, they are struggling, and some have even taken their own lives. So can the Chancellor tell me, are we to assume after 8 months without any change in policy that he deems it politically expedient to exclude these people because they just don't matter?
Chancellor.
Mr Speaker, I'm sure the Honourable Lady heard the answer to the previous question on this. She keeps mentioning this 3 million figure without perhaps giving an explanation of whether she agrees that 1.5 million of those should be included, given that they make the majority of their earnings from employment, are eligible to be furloughed, and indeed that was an approach that was supported by all trade organisations at the time this scheme was launched.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. 15 years ago, after following the MG Rover collapse, there is still 150 acres of unused land in Longbridge, which could be used to provide the much-needed jobs that we need locally. And so will the Chancellor support my campaign, along with the Mayor Andy Street, to make sure that Longbridge is at the top of the list when it comes to levelling up, to make sure that we have those jobs right across Northfield?
Chancellor.
Well, that sounds like an excellent idea, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I hope that the £400 million Brownfield Fund, which is part of our housing fund, could potentially be of help. And I know the Mayor, Andy Street, has spoken to the Housing Secretary about how best he can access the Brownfield Fund. It sounds like the kind of project it's designed to help.
Emma Buck.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor has repeatedly said he doesn't recognise them, but today 3 million taxpayers, including many of my constituents who've been excluded from any support at all, will have been in anguish waiting for his statement. Far from protecting lives and livelihoods, he's let them down yet again. Their income down to zero, losing their homes, unable to feed their families, and again, some have even taken their own lives. Is it that the Chancellor doesn't understand the heartache and hopelessness of poverty, or is it simply that he just does not care?
Chancellor.
Mr Speaker, anyone in the circumstances described by the Honourable Lady would surely be eligible for support through universal credit, which can provide, depending on the circumstances, somewhere between £1,500 and £1,800 per family per month to help support them if that's what they need. And she talks about self-employed as if perhaps they are not also people who benefit from better hospitals, better schools, better local infrastructure and safer streets. That's what this spending review delivers, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it will benefit everybody in the United Kingdom in that way.
Video link. Marco Longhi.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I very much welcome my right honourable friend's statement and strongly applaud the government's commitment to fund the NHS with investment in hospitals, such as the £3 million for Russell's Hall Hospital, the A&E in Dudley. But not just that, it's the investment in diagnostic equipment, as well as more nurses and GP appointments. Can he outline how these commitments help the Conservative Party meet its manifesto commitments to deliver stronger public services, such as 50,000 more nurses?
Chancellor.
Mr Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Not only are we maintaining our commitment to the NHS's 5-year long-term settlement, we're providing additional funds, £3 billion for COVID recovery this year, but also fully funding the extra funding required to deliver on those commitments of 50,000 more nurses, 50 million more GP appointments, and indeed 40 new hospitals.
Ali.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The British people have faced an incredibly difficult year with COVID and the resulting economic crisis. Then we have the looming prospect of either a no-deal Brexit or a minimalist one that will be very disruptive for businesses. And the OBR has forecasted that 5.2% of loss of potential GDP over the next 15 years. The governor has said that we could see a 2 to 3 times as bad situation with a no-deal Brexit. How much more economic carnage and unemployment should the British people expect with these two scenarios on top of coronavirus and its impacts?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, what I'd say is our teams are hard at work, and I'm very hopeful that we can reach a constructive agreement with our European friends and partners. Our wishes in this negotiation have always been consistent and transparent and are based entirely on precedent of what other countries have achieved with the EU. So I'm very much hopeful with good work and a constructive attitude we can get there, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Sir David Davis.
In what must be the most challenging circumstances ever to deliver a spending review, I welcome the Restart scheme to help the unemployed. But last year, £500 million was announced to help youth services, and Southend YMCA greatly benefited from that. Will the Chancellor recommit to that £500 million, and will he set out a time frame which that can be delivered over the next 5 years?
Mr Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right about the importance of youth services. I'm not entirely sure exactly which bit he's referring to. We're happy to talk to him further about it. He will see in the spending review today that the National Citizenship Service is still there, and we've provided more funding for capital projects for youth organisations, but I'd happily pick up the specific case he mentioned separately.
Kevin Holmrek.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement, particularly the Levelling Up Fund, and can I make an immediate representation for the dualling of the A64 in my constituency. Also welcome the changes to the Green Book. Will you take a similar look at the Housing Infrastructure Fund, which also has a built-in bias towards spending in London and the South East?
Well, I know this is an area that my honourable friend knows particularly well, so I'm very much happy to take him up on that suggestion and discuss his concerns with the Housing Secretary, and I thank him for bringing it to my attention.
Tim Farron.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. There are some positives for the NHS in the Chancellor's statement, but it does feel like there is a blind spot. In the detailed document, as far as I can tell, there is only one reference to cancer. Bear in mind that the clinicians estimate that we will lose 60,000 years unnecessarily to cancer deaths during this time, and that it may take 5 years for the government, the NHS, to catch up with the colossal cancer backlog. There is no reference to the urgent investment in radiotherapy or other treatment mechanisms that are necessary to catch up with cancer in his statement. Will he think again? Will he meet with me and a cross-party group of MPs, clinicians and patients living with cancer, so we can think again, act now and save lives?
Mr Deputy Speaker, of course it would be for the Secretary of State for Health to underdo the detailed allocations of this budget, but I would point to the £3 billion for COVID recovery, £1 billion of which is to help tackle the backlog, both of elective surgery but also screening and diagnostics, which I think will help. We also have provided £325 million, Mr Deputy Speaker, to invest in new diagnostic machines, replacing ageing machines, about 2/3, which presumably does help with referrals and identification of cancer. But of course, the Secretary of State for Health would be the best person to discuss the exact allocation of the increased NHS budgets.
Video link. Andy Carter.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I praise the very measured and sensible way the Chancellor has approached this spending review, and I welcome in particular the infrastructure fund with levelling up in the north of England, a real priority. I look forward to discussing more projects for Warrington South with him. I'm particularly pleased to see those working in the lowest paid public sector jobs will also get a pay increase. But can he confirm the extra police officers promised for Cheshire will be delivered so that we can tackle antisocial behaviour and protect our communities from the dreadful impact of county lines drug gangs?
Councillor.
My honourable friend is absolutely right about the importance of safer streets. I'm pleased to tell him this spending review makes available £400 million more for the Home Office and local policing to make sure that we can recruit an additional 6,000 police officers next year on top of the 6,000 this year in order to make great progress on our way to 20,000 by 2023.
Video link. Matt Vickers.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My right honourable friend has had to make some tough decisions on issues like foreign aid, but can he assure me that by doing this, he'll be able to focus on domestic priorities and the levelling up agenda that can do so much for so many in Teesside?
Yeah, I thank my honourable friend for the question. He's absolutely right. This spending review is about focusing on the priorities of our constituents. And I'm sure he's will be pleased to know, and his constituents will be pleased to know, that we've made available £3 million today for the Tees Valley Hydrogen Transport Hub. Teesside is at the heart of our hydrogen revolution, bringing new jobs and attracting investment and driving growth in his local area. And that's an example of the kind of local priority that we can now fund, having made these tough decisions.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor said he wanted to invest in the places that we call home, but the homes of thousands of leaseholders are currently worthless fire risks because of the cladding scandal which they didn't cause. Now, he will be well aware that the 1.6 billion he's already allocated is nowhere near enough to make all of these homes safe again. The leaseholders don't have the money, and as far as I can tell, looking at the Blue Book, not an additional single penny has been allocated. So my question to him is, how much longer will my constituents have to wait before they are able once again to call the place in which they live a home?
Mr Speaker, I'd say to the right honourable gentleman, we have made available £1.6 billion, which means at this moment 80% of high-rise buildings with ACM cladding have work underway or complete. That number is likely to rise to 100% by the end of the year. And with regard to people who are unable to move, I think he is referring to the issue with the EWS1 certificates, which I think the Secretary of State made a statement on this recently, but he'll be pleased to know £700,000 was made available to help more assessors qualify to undertake those assessments. And I know my right honourable friend, the Housing Secretary, is in conversations with UK Finance and RICS to ensure that use or demand of those certificates is appropriate and proportionate to the needs of the situation.
Video link. Julian Sturdy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I understand my right honourable friend has had to make some difficult decisions. And as we seek to rebuild our economy in the months ahead, I'm delighted to hear his commitment to investment in infrastructure. But can he set out what that means for the North, and in particular for York and North Yorkshire, and what benefits that will bring to my constituents in York Outer?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend, and he's right. This is about making difficult decisions so that we can prioritise the things that our constituents want us to. I know in his area he'll be pleased to know that there has been a success for access to the new stations fund. I think for the Haxby station, that's an example of this government delivering on its promises, trying to find ways to improve local transport infrastructure in his local area to drive growth and opportunity, and we will relentlessly focus on those types of priorities.
Video link. Barry Sherman.
Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you. Can I ask the Chancellor of the Exchequer, can we have this new infrastructure bank in Yorkshire and in Huddersfield in particular? And is he sure that he has paid enough attention to the tremendous challenge of young people's unemployment and young people who want to get into a job, who want to be trained? And is his programme today, that he's announced today, sufficient to train a whole new generation of young people as green apprentices?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I of course would be sympathetic to the idea of putting the bank in Yorkshire, as the honourable gentleman knows, but I have to tell him he was slightly beaten to the punch over the weekend, I think, by my honourable friend from Shipley making a pitch for Bradford. But in any case, I'll happily hear his thoughts. He's right about the focus on young people. The new Restart programme will be able to help 1 million people who have been unemployed for over a year. But before even that happens, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we've got the Kickstart programme, which will benefit 250,000 young people more if the programme is successful. And he talked about apprenticeships. Rightly, we've increased the cash bonus to businesses to £3,000 for them to take on a fresh new young apprentice, because he is right, that is where our focus should be.
Jane Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I thank the Chancellor for a range of measures to support those on low incomes and also to protect the most vulnerable, whether that's by an uplift to cash for local authorities to identify and support vulnerable families, or with the holiday activities and food programme, an uplift to the Healthy Start programme. Levelling up is crucial to a seat like Wolverhampton North East. Can the Chancellor reassure my constituents that this government will continue to prioritise job creation, investment and other opportunities for them?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. This government is committed to spreading opportunity across the country, especially in places where people feel they haven't had the same fair crack at the whip as before. Our Levelling Up Fund is designed to correct that, and I know also today that whole local area will be benefiting from discounted funding from the Public Works Loan Board to help with local infrastructure projects. That's a symbol of our commitment to her area and her constituents.
Mr. Sen.
The Chancellor said that my honourable friends were wrong about the number of working people excluded from financial support. It's the freelancers and the self-employed who haven't had any support who think he is wrong. In the Liverpool City region, the Mayor Steve Rotherham has found a package to support some of those people who have been excluded. So when is the Chancellor going to step up and support Steve Rotherham, Andy Burnham and the other Labour leaders in local government and put that support package together? He has to admit that these people have not qualified for furlough, they have not qualified for the self-employed support or the business grants either, and most of them are not eligible for universal credit. When is he going to end this burning injustice?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, £1 billion has been provided to local authorities across the country to support their businesses and local economies as they see fit. And of course that funding has made available to his local authority. If that's how they choose to use it, of course that is up to them. But there's a range of different support we've provided, Mr. Deputy Speaker, whether it's loans, whether it is access to our more generous welfare system, or indeed mortgage holidays that 1 in 6 mortgage holders use in the end. These are all ways that we've tried to do our best to provide support to the largest number of people possible.
Mr.
Speaker, I wholeheartedly welcome the announcement that doctors, nurses and NHS workers will be getting a pay increase. This crisis has also shown that we desperately need to invest in our urgent care capacity. That's why I've been campaigning for new urgent care centres for both Tameside Hospital and Stepping Hill Hospital. Will the Chancellor confirm that the government remains 100% committed to the NHS hospital upgrade programme?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. On top of the actually existing in-year funding we provided to deal with winter pressures for A&E, this SR confirms £3.7 billion of funding over the next few years to deliver both our 40 new hospitals that we talked about and indeed 70 hospital upgrades as well. So rest assured we do remain completely committed to this programme.
Video link. Carla Lockhart.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I thank the Chancellor for his statement and welcome the additional financial support for the NI Executive. I also look forward to the detail of the pay rise for nurses, doctors and healthcare workers and how Northern Ireland healthcare professionals can benefit. In my constituency of Upper Bann, the private sector has been absolutely devastated by COVID-19, and had it not been for the support provided by him, many businesses would be closed. What will the Chancellor do to ensure the private sector recovery is supported across the United Kingdom, and will he undertake to show his clear commitment to UK-wide recovery by visiting my constituency when the restrictions permit, to meet businesses who want to thank him and to be part of our national economic recovery?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her kind comments, and she's right about the importance of especially our small and medium-sized businesses to help drive our recovery. We've provided cash grant support to them, the ones that are most impacted by the restrictions. That extra funding comes to Northern Ireland. But also our UK-wide basis, we've provided tax cuts, grants, loans, and other things that she'll be aware of. And she can rest assured that I will keep all of that in my mind as we think about how to exit this crisis. And I look forward to my first visit as Chancellor, hopefully to Northern Ireland in the near future.
Angela Richardson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's statement this afternoon. He will know that affordable housing is needed in my constituency of Guildford, but development is constrained by Greenbelt, which we are rightly enhancing and protecting as a manifesto commitment. Therefore, would he outline what fiscal steps he is taking to support councils like mine in regenerating brownfield sites?
I thank the Honourable Lady. She's absolutely right about the importance of going to brownfield first. And today's spending review makes available an additional £100 million for non-mayoral combined authorities to access remediation funding. My right honourable friend, the Housing Secretary, will be able to talk to her in more detail about that. But it's exactly the kind of thing that I think could make a difference in her constituency.
Video link. Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. By introducing the emergency measure to increase universal credit by £20 per week, the Chancellor was acknowledging what many have known for years, that universal credit is simply not enough to live on. If that was the case during this pandemic, why won't he commit to retaining this uplift permanently?
Mr Deputy Speaker, we put in place a range of temporary measures because we were dealing with an unprecedented crisis. We are now working our way through that crisis, and the future looks brighter considerably than it did in March, not least because of the medical advancements and our ability to do improved testing as well, so we can look forward. We keep everything under review, Mr Deputy Speaker. The uplift lasts all the way to the spring. As we get to the spring and have more clarity about the future path of our economy and restrictions, we will of course be mindful of how to support and protect those who are most vulnerable in our society.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Whilst I share some of the concerns expressed by colleagues about the aid budget, can I say to my right honourable friend that if we are to continue asking our constituents to make sacrifices, I think it's a temporary move is the right one. And could I ask for an assurance that the Greater Grimsby Town deal, which is of great benefit to my Cleethorpes constituency, will continue to be funded? And he's aware from a note I gave him last week that a modest support for LNER would restore our direct rail service to London. I would hope that he can achieve that. Thank you.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank my honourable friends for his support, and he's right about the need, my need to make difficult decisions, tough choices, so that we can prioritise the things that he talked about. I believe today his local area has received some seed funding to examine proposals for the South Humber line. I hope that will make a difference to his constituents, and I hope our Levelling Up Fund could be something that he and I have a productive conversation about as we figure out how best to support the wonderful town of Grimsby with its future ambitions.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is irresponsible to pit public sector and private sector workers against each other in the race to the bottom on wages, especially when key workers across both sectors kept us going through the pandemic. Notwithstanding the small amount paid to low-paid workers who frankly deserve better, this pay freeze for civil servants will also freeze any meaningful action on tackling the gender pay gap in the civil service, which is 12%. Will the Chancellor outline what discussions he's had about eradicating the gender pay gap in the government departments with the Cabinet Office?
So, Mr Deputy Speaker, just for the record, no one is trying to pit anyone against anyone else. This is simply about doing what is fair for the country. It is the right decision to make. It is a difficult decision, but we have taken a targeted approach to protect those on lower incomes, protect those in the NHS, ensuring that a majority of public servants will receive an increase in their pay next year. And I'll be very happy to go away and look at the example she gave of the gender pay gap in the civil service and make sure that we are making good progress to eliminating that.
Video link. Mike Wood.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
We all want to see people's wages going up again after this pandemic. My right honourable friend's statement provides a strong foundation for securing that. At a time when many workers in the private sector face cuts or job losses, I can understand why it's necessary to pause public sector pay rises other than those for frontline NHS workers and those earning less than the national average. But will he join me in urging the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority to make sure that that freeze must also extend to the salaries of members of Parliament?
Well, I think my honourable friend makes an excellent point, and the way he framed it, well, I think was spot on. He will be reassured to know that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster has written to IPSA on behalf of the government, the Prime Minister and I, to express our views on the situation and to enable them to be informed about the pay policy that we put in place in the public sector, and urge them to take account of that when they set pay policy. Of course, they're an independent body, but I would hope very much that they look at what we're doing.
Video link. Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Youth Violence Commission report published earlier this year highlighted the importance of high-quality youth services provision. Yet in a recent written response to the report, the member for Loughton Horncastle made no mention of the Youth Investment Fund, and the same applies to the Chancellor today. Indeed, when the member for Southend West asked about this, the Chancellor didn't seem to know what he was on about. Does this mean the promised and already delayed 500 million has been shelved?
No, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it hasn't been shelved, but I can tell the Honourable Lady there is extra funding in this spending review for youth services. There's an amount of money for extra capital projects for youth clubs, and of course funding for the National Citizenship Service, and more generally the government will review its approach to all youth services later this spring, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, will set out details in due course.
Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I welcome the focus on infrastructure in this statement. As my right honourable friend knows, I chair the all-party infrastructure group, and I can tell him that the industry has been looking for certainty, as he is providing today. Does he agree with me that certainty will allow the industry to plan better and through that to deliver better value, and also develop skills programmes, including apprenticeship programmes?
Yeah, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and it's that because of that multi-year certainty, particularly on the capital side, that we can deliver projects more efficiently, faster and at lower cost, and that certainty also helps the supply chain to take on new apprentices, helped indeed by our apprenticeship bonus as well. But he's absolutely right, we must train the next generation and create jobs as we deliver this infrastructure, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Britain's publicans and the wider hospitality trade are facing a catastrophic Christmas. The government's mishandling of coronavirus and the lack of evidence behind the policies on pubs particularly, and the lack of a financial package to support them going forward from this second lockdown, is going to mean many of them never open their doors again. Will the Chancellor, rather than getting to his feet and congratulating him on what he did in the first lockdown, actually give Britain's publicans some kind of sense that there's a package coming that might see them through the winter?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the reason I talk about things that we've done is because they last all the way through the winter to next spring, whether that's the VAT cut or indeed the business rates holiday. I've consistently come to this dispatch box to support the hospitality industry. Many times actually accused of doing the wrong thing by members opposite, but the local restrictions grants that we've put in place will last through the winter, which means that if a pub is closed, it will receive up to £3,000 per month, which when you look at the average rateable value of a pub in England, means that the vast majority of small and medium-sized pubs will have their rent covered by that. Of course, they can furlough their staff as well, and for those pubs operating in Tier 2 areas under restrictions, they will still get a grant worth 70% of that value. So of course we're trying to do what we can to support the hospitality sector. I've done that since the beginning of this crisis, and I will keep doing so.
Nikki Hagan.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. May I congratulate my right honourable friend for the statement today, and also for his stamina, as I'm the 80th question he's answered so far this afternoon. Mr. Deputy Speaker, rough sleeping is a subject that's very close to my heart, and tackling the causes of rough sleeping. Sadly, in my constituency, we see more rough sleepers than any other constituency in the United Kingdom. Would my right honourable friend give me assurances that today in his statement he will be providing
financial support so we can make sure that we can focus on the government's priority to end rough sleeping by 2024?
I can give my honourable friend that assurance. There's £250 million, I think £254 million made available to local authorities to help end rough sleeping. That's a 60% increase in cash terms on the money available this year, because she's absolutely right. This is something that we must end, and the funding, I know, will make an enormous difference in her constituency, and I know it's an issue she cares passionately about.
And Brown.
Mr Deputy Speaker, Braehead Foods, a large employer in my constituency, supplies top quality produce all over the United Kingdom. Now, furlough has been welcome for them, but they need additional support to cover fixed overheads while borrowing is maxed out and orders are almost non-existent. So please reconsider past requests from myself and the Federation of Wholesale Distributors and provide a grant or rates relief system that can be replicated in Scotland for UK food wholesalers like Braehead that are above the 51,000 business rates threshold, so that they can actually stay afloat and then play their part in the post-COVID economic recovery.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, business rates are of course a devolved competency, and I'm sure the honourable gentleman can talk to the Scottish Government about their plans. They obviously will receive £2.4 billion of Barnett consequentials as a result of what we're doing this year, and it could be that they could choose to use some of that funding to provide support in the way that he asked.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Earlier this week I spoke with many people and companies, training providers and others in my constituency talking about apprenticeships and how we need to improve the system, make it more flexible. Would the Chancellor set out in further detail what measures this spending review will do to help businesses, training providers and young people get the apprenticeships that they deserve?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend knows this well with his own business experience, and he's absolutely right. What business has been asking for is more flexibility with how levy funds are used. I'm pleased that we can deliver that today. It means businesses can transfer their unspent levy funds down the supply chain easily in bulk to small and medium-sized companies. We're going to create a matching service for that to happen, and we're also going to allow employers in certain industries at first to front-load some of the training funding, which is what they also wanted. Those obviously will be funded by the government, all those changes that happen as a result of us getting less in the levy funding, but we think they're the right thing to do. They will support business and support apprenticeships, and he's right to raise it.
James Wilde.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The focus on the NHS and infrastructure is welcome, and the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in King's Lynn is on the front line of dealing with COVID, and it's 40 years old, but was built only to last 30 years. So will my honourable friend look seriously at the compelling case for QEH to be one of the 8 additional hospitals to be built on top of the 40 announced today?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I look forward to hearing from my honourable friend about the plans that he has and the ambitions for his local hospital. I know the Secretary of State for Health will also be interested. He will know how committed we all are to improving our hospitals and having new ones across the UK. There's funding for that today, but I'm happy to discuss further.
Video link. Beth Winter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In Wales, aerospace generates 1.47 billion in GVA for the Welsh economy. Since the pandemic, GE Aviation, which employs 200 of my constituents, has suffered 600 job losses, with future job losses likely. The sector faces a very uncertain future, which will have a devastating impact on our communities. These highly skilled workers have transferable skills. With the Chancellor's stated interest in funding the development of green initiatives, would he consider a sector-specific package to support such a development for my constituents?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I know in my conversations with industry, one of the things they were very keen to see was an extension of our job support and furlough schemes, which is something we have been able to provide, and I know that will make a difference in preserving those valuable skill matches she talked about. And she will also know that there is an existing R&D pot the Department for Business runs, where it works with the aerospace industry to access, and also some of the new R&D we've put aside for our net zero transition will also help, because it's designed on reducing emissions and finding new ways ways in the transportation sector.
William Ragg.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As somebody who campaigns to protect Greenbelt land, I welcome my right honourable friend's additional investment in prioritising brownfield development. His changes to the Green Book will also benefit the North West for infrastructure investment, but will he say more about what he can do to incentivise business growth in the north of England, which will bring jobs and, importantly, tax revenue to fund many of his spending commitments he's announced today?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend's absolutely right. Although not part of the spending review, but just very recently announced, is the extension to the annual investment allowance. It was due to expire at the end of this year. This allows small and medium-sized companies to write off in full investments of up to £1 million. So that is a tax break that we are extending into next year. I know it will be warmly welcomed by businesses in his constituency, allow them to invest in their growth in a tax-advantaged way.
Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Brighton and Hove has double the national average of people renting their homes, and yet the cost of rental in Brighton and Hove is the same price as central London. I am hearing from an alarming number of people who are struggling to pay their rent. They're either running businesses or they're in employment which isn't covering the bills, they are running out of savings, and soon they will be destitute. Can the Chancellor say, he didn't say anything about rental homes in his statement, what assistance can be given to making sure that people can stay in their homes till the end of this crisis and they can start earning money again?
Mr Deputy Speaker, what I can say is that the local housing allowance uplift that we put in place this year will be maintained into next year, the £1 billion, and I know that is of benefit to about 1 million households at about £600 each. So that's the main announcement today, but I'd be very happy to hear if there are further things. He'll know about our £12 billion affordable homes programme, which is designed to build 180,000 affordable homes over the coming years as well.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And it's almost exactly a year since we launched our manifesto, and today's sobering statement has laid bare the impact that the pandemic has had on the nation's finances and the difficult choices that the Chancellor is having to make. And he has done well to keep manifesto pledges on track. But I feel I need to make it clear that I personally feel ashamed that the only manifesto pledge we are breaking today is our promise to the world's poorest.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I know this is a topic on which my honourable friend feels very passionately about, and rightly so. As she would have heard me say, that this is something that we do with heavy heart, and it's something that enables us to make progress on our other priorities, and it is indeed temporary. We intend to return to 0.7% when the fiscal circumstances allow.
Video link. Audio link. Margaret Ferrier.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, public sector pay is now at its lowest level in decades relative to the private sector. While the announcement of a pay rise for NHS workers is welcome, other public sector workers will be put in even greater financial insecurity by the pay freeze. Does the Chancellor not feel that in the context of the great work they're doing at the moment in this pandemic, this public sector pay cap is a dramatic failure to show our appreciation for all their hard work?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I think the Honourable Lady mentioned the relative pay premium. It's worth bearing in mind that there still is a pay premium. The latest numbers we have from 2019 show a 7% pay premium between public and private sector wages, and that premium will without doubt have been exacerbated by the growing disparity in public-private sector wages that we are seeing this year. So in the interest of fairness and in the interest of protecting public sector jobs, I think it is right that we have taken a targeted approach, prioritise pay rises for those on lower incomes and in the NHS.
Tom Hunt.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I very much welcome the £4 billion levelling up fund, but it can't just be about the North and the Midlands. Ipswich will need to be part of the mix as well there. I also welcome the schools budget, over £7 billion extra funding into schools, but I'm very passionate about special educational needs provision, as the Chancellor will know, and I just wanted assurances from him that when we're talking about this extra investment, we're talking about the extra 500 schools over the next decade. That must include providing first-class special educational needs provision, which does cost a lot, but is absolutely worth it.
Well, I know about my honourable friend's passion for this subject. I'm pleased to be able to tell him £300 million has been allocated for new school places for children with special educational needs and disabilities. I think about 4 times as much as was provided to local authorities a year ago.
Meg Hillier.
Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, we've heard a very much a smoke and mirrors statement today, with the Chancellor repeatedly saying there's more cash year on year than in the last decade. Well, that's easy to say after 10 years of austerity and cuts. But I want to focus particularly on the local government settlement, which actually is a static settlement on the departmental expenditure limit, but has this mysterious phrase, the core spending power, which has become commonplace now in government, which includes the option to increase council tax. Council tax is a regressive tax. There are some councils with a very low council tax base where the percentage increase will mean very little money into the coffers. So even were councils to go down this route, how is he going to make sure in his levelling up agenda that those councils don't lose out because they've got a lower council tax base?
Mr Deputy Speaker, as former local government minister, fortunately my first job, I'm happy to tell the Honourable Lady there's nothing smoke and mirrors about core spending power. It is the metric on which the local government finance settlement is done every year. It is the main metric that is focused on, and it is going up 4.5%, which is a very high level compared to any of the last years. She's right about how council tax works, which is why we've put in an additional £300 million of grant. That comes on top of the existing grant. Part of that is used for equalisation. The exact way that that works is a matter for MHCLG, but as is always the case, we have an equalisation element to the grant to deal with the issue that she specifically raised.
I'm talking that.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. First of all, may I pay tribute to my right honourable friend who's got the most extraordinary, difficult job in juggling the nation's finances at this time. I pay tribute to his investment in levelling up, and I also pay tribute to his focus on business, which after all is going to pay for all the money that he's just spent. Could he perhaps tell me a little bit about the aid budget, however? Because what I've noticed 20 basis points moving from aid into defence, a very welcome defence budget, certainly, but at a time when aid has never been more needed, in extending the perimeter of our public health to countries where otherwise the COVID crisis would run wild, surely this is not exactly the right moment to be reducing those defences. And secondly, would he agree with me that the 2015 Act, to which he's made reference this afternoon, clearly gives him the opportunity to opt out of the 0.7 target according to 3 different metrics, all of which are covered by the COVID crisis, and therefore he can do his reduction, if he feels it is necessary, with no change in the law whatsoever?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm thankful to my honourable friend for his comments and indeed the constructive conversations I've had with him on both our aid budget but also our defence budget and more generally our place in the world, which he rightly champions and does a very good job of. And he's right that we should look holistically at that, and he made a good argument for why we play a role, particularly with providing security through our defence budget to many places. Given that he's right also about the 2015 Act and the so-called ouster provision contained within it, but given we cannot predict with sufficient certainty when exactly the current fiscal circumstances will have improved and our need to plan accordingly, we do intend to look at bringing forward appropriate legislation in due course, but my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, will be making a statement tomorrow and can answer the question in more detail.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Deputy Speaker, may I admire my right honourable friend the Chancellor's stamina in answering well over 90 questions. Can I also warmly welcome his statement this afternoon, and in particular the £100 billion he announced on infrastructure spending, which of course includes some vital projects in my constituency, notably the levelling up fund of the feasibility study for the Cirencester Light Railway, the reconfirmation of the funding for the A417, and above all, the extra funding for gigabit broadband, which my rural constituency suffers from. So will he confirm that very hard-hit economies like Gloucestershire will benefit from this infrastructure funding, and it will help speed up a strong recovery?
Can I thank my right honourable friend for his kind words and support, and he's absolutely right. We want to make sure that this record investment in infrastructure brings tangible benefit to our constituents wherever they live, whether that's in the rural southwest or a town up in the northeast. All of the people of this country should see measurable improvement in the quality of their lives and the opportunities that they can seize ahead of them. That is something that this government will focus relentlessly on and intends to deliver.
It's not often I get to bring